Book 3, Chapter 20 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 20, The People's America. At his evening meetings on the street, Jake Vodell, with stirring oratory, kindled the fire of his cause. In the councils of the unions, through individuals and groups with clever arguments and inflaming literature, he sought recruits. With stinging sarcasm and withering scorn, he taunted the laboring people, told them they were fools and cowards to submit to the degrading slavery of their capitalist owners. With biting invective and blistering epithet, he pictured their employer enemies as the brutal and ruthless destroyers of their homes. With thrilling eloquence, he fanned the flames of class hatred, inspired the loyalty of his followers to himself, and held out to them golden promises of reward if they would prove themselves men and take that which belonged to them. But the Mill Workers' Union, as an organization, was steadfast in its refusal to be dominated by this agitator who was so clearly antagonistic to every principle of American citizenship. Jake Vodell could neither lead nor drive them into a strike that was so evidently called in the interests of his cause. And more the agitator was compelled to recognize the powerful influence of the interpreter. It was not long before he went to the hut on the cliff with a positive demand for the old basket-maker's open support. "I don't know why it is," he said, "that a poor old cripple like you should have such power among men, but I know it is so. You can tell this Captain Charlie and his crowd of fools that they must help me to win for the laboring people their freedom. You shall, for me, enlist these mill men in the cause." The interpreter asked gravely, "And when you have accomplished this that you call freedom, when you've gained this equality that you talk about, how will your brotherhood be governed?" Jake Vodell scowled as he gazed at the man in the wheelchair with a quick suspicion. "Governed?" "Yes," returned the interpreter. "Without organization of some sort, nothing can be done. No industries can be carried on without the concerted effort, which is organization. Without the industry that is necessary to human life, the free people you picture cannot exist. Without government, which means laws and the enforcement of law, organization of any kind is impossible." "There'll have to be organization, certainly," answered Vodell. "Then there will be leaders, directors, managers with authority, to whom the people must surrender themselves as individuals," said the interpreter quietly. "An organization without leadership is impossible." The agitator's voice was triumphant as he said, "Certainly there'll be leaders, and their authority will be unquestioned. And these leaders will be those who have led the people out of the miserable bondage of their present condition." The interpreter's voice had a new note in it now as he said, "In other words, sir, what you propose is simply to substitute yourself for McIver. You propose to the people that they overthrow their present leaders in the industries of their nation in order that you and your fellow agitators may become their masters. You demand that the citizens of America abolish their national government and in its place accept you and your fellows as their rulers. What assurance can you give the people, sir, that under your rule they will have more freedom for self-government, more opportunities for self-advancement and prosperity and happiness than they have at present?" "Assurance," muttered the other, startled by the interpreter's manner. The old basket-maker continued, "Are you and your self-constituted leaders of the American working people gods? Are you not as human as any McIver or Adam Ward of the very class you condemn? Would you not be subject to the same temptations of power, the same human passions? Would you not, given the same opportunity, be all that you say they are, or worse?" Jake Vodell's countenance was black with rage. He started to rise, but a movement of Billy Rand made him hesitate. His voice was harsh with menacing passion. "And you call yourself a friend of the laboring class?" "It is because I am a friend of my fellow American citizens that I ask you what freedom your brotherhood can assure to us that we have not now," the interpreter answered solemnly. "Look there, sir." He swept in a gesture the scene that lay within view of his balcony porch. "That is America, my America, the America of the people, from the wretched hovels of the incompetent and unfortunate Sam Whaleys in the flats down there to Adam Ward's castle on the hill yonder. It is our America. From the happy little home of that sterling workman Peter Martin to the homes of the business workers on the hillside over there, it is ours. From the business district to the beautiful farms across the river, it belongs to us all. And the mill there, representing as it does the industries of our nation and standing for the very life of our people, is our mill. The troubles that disturb us, the problems of injustice, the wrongs of selfishness that arise through such employers as McIver and such employees as Sam Whaley, are our troubles. And we will settle our own difficulties in our own way as loyal American citizens. The self-appointed apostle of the new freedom had by this time regained his self-control. His only answer to the interpreter was a shrug of his thick shoulders and a flash of white teeth in his black beard. The old basket-maker, with his eyes still on the scene that lay before them, continued. "Because I love my countrymen, sir, I protest the destructive teachings of your brotherhood. Your ambitious schemes would plunge my country into a bloody revolution, the horrors of which defy the imagination. America will find a better way. The loyal American citizens who labor in our industries and the equally loyal American operators of these industries will never consent to the ruthless murder by hundreds and thousands of our best brains and our best manhood in support of your visionary theories. My countrymen will never permit the unholy slaughter of innocent women and children that would result from your efforts to overthrow our government and establish a wholly impossible utopia upon the basis of an equality that is contrary to every law of life. You preach freedom to the working people in order to rob them of the freedom they already have. With visions of impossible wealth and luxurious idleness, you blind them to the greater happiness that is within reach of their industry. In the name of an equality, the possibility of which your own assumed leadership denies, you incite a class hatred and breed an intolerance and envy that destroy the good feeling of comradeship and break down the noble spirit of that actual equality which we already have and which is our only salvation." "Equality," sneered Jake Vodell. "You have a fine equality in this country of capitalist-ridden fools who are too cowardly to say that their souls are their own. It is the equality of Adam Ward and Sam Whaley, I suppose." "Sam Whaley is a product of your teaching, sir," the interpreter answered. "The equality of which I speak is that of Adam Ward and Peter Martin, as it is evidenced in the building up of the mill. It is the equality that is in the comradeship of their sons John and Charlie, who will protect and carry on the work of their fathers. It is the equality of a common citizenship, of mutual dependence of employer and employee upon the industries. It is the equality of a common citizenship, of mutual dependence of employer and employee upon the industries that alone can save our people from want and starvation and guard our nation from the horrors you would bring upon it." The man laughed. "Suppose you sing that pretty song to McIver, eh? What do you think he would say?" "He would laugh, as you're laughing," returned the interpreter sadly. "Tell it to Adam Ward, then," jeered the other. "He will recognize his equality with Peter Martin when you explain it, eh?" "Adam Ward is already paying a terrible price for denying it," the interpreter answered. Again Jake Vodell laughed with sneering triumph. "Well, then I guess you'll have to preach your equality to the deaf and dumb man there. Maybe you can make him understand it. The old basket maker without any legs and the big husky who can neither hear nor talk. They're equals, I suppose, eh?" "Billy Rand and I perfectly illustrate the equality of dependence, sir," returned the interpreter. "Billy is as much my superior physically as I am his superior mentally. Without my thinking and planning, he would be as helpless as I would be without his good bodily strength. We are each equally dependent upon the other, and from that mutual dependence comes our comradeship in the industry which alone secures for us the necessities of life. I could not make baskets without Billy's labor. Billy could not make baskets without my planning and directing. And yet, sir, you and McIver would set us to fighting each other. You would have Billy deny his dependence upon me and use his strength to destroy me, thus depriving himself of the help he must have if he would live. McIver would have me deny my dependence upon Billy, and by antagonizing him with my assumed superiority, turn his strength to the destruction of our comradeship by which I also live. Your teaching of class loyalty and class hatred applied to Billy and me would result in the ruin of our basket-making and in our consequent starvation." Again the interpreter from his wheelchair pointed with outstretched arm to the scene that lay with all its varied grades of life, social levels, and individual interest before them. "Look," he said, "to the inequality that is there, inequalities that are as great as the difference between Billy Rand and myself. And yet every individual life is dependent upon all the other individual lives. The mill yonder is the basket-making of the people. All alike must look to it for life itself. The industries without which the people cannot exist can be carried on only by the comradeship of those who labor with their hands and those who work with their brains. In the common dependence, all are equal. The only equality that your leadership, with its progress of destruction, can ensure to American employers and employees is an equality of indescribable suffering and death." The old basket-maker paused a moment before he added solemnly, "I wonder that you dare assume the responsibility for such a catastrophe. Have you no God, sir, to whom you must eventually account?" The man's teeth gleamed in a grin of malicious sarcasm. "I should know that you believed in God. Bah! An old woman myth to scare fools and children. I suppose you believe in miracles also." "I believe in the miracle of life," the interpreter answered, "and in the great laws of life, the law of inequality and dependence that in its operation ensures the oneness of all things." The agitator rose to his feet and with a shrug of contempt said, "Very pretty, Mr. Interpreter, very pretty. You watch now from your hut here, and you shall see what men who are not crippled old basket-makers will do with that little bit of your America out there. It is I who will teach Peter Martin and his comrades in the mill how to deal with your friend Adam Ward and his class." "You are too late, sir," said the interpreter as the man moved toward the door. Jake Vodell turned. How too late? Then, as he saw Billy Rand rising to his feet, his hand went quickly inside his vest. The old basket-maker smiled as he once more held out a restraining hand toward his companion. "I do not mean anything like that, sir. I told you some time ago that you were defeated in your Millsburg campaign by Adam Ward's retirement from the mill. You are too late because you are forced now to deal not with Adam Ward and Peter Martin, but with their sons." "Oh, and what you should say also is that I'm forced to deal with an old basket-maker who has no legs, eh? Well, we shall see about that, too, Mr. Interpreter. When the time comes, we shall see." End of chapter 20. Book 3, Chapter 21 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 21, Peter Martin's Problem. It was not long until the idle workmen began to feel the want of their pay envelopes. The grocers and butchers were as dependent upon those pay envelopes as were the workmen themselves. The winter was coming on. There was a chill in the air. In the homes of the strikers, the mothers and their little ones needed not only food, but fuel and clothing as well. The crowds at the evening street meetings became more ominous. Through the long idle days, grim, sullen-faced men walked the streets, or stood in groups on the corners watching their fellow citizens and muttering in low, guarded tones. Members of the Mill Workers' Union were openly branded as cowards and traitors to their class. The suffering among the women and children became acute. But Jake Vodell was a master who demanded of his disciples most heroic loyalty without a thought of the cost to them. McIver put an armed guard about his factory and boasted that he could live without work. The strikers, he declared, could either starve themselves and their families or accept his terms. The agitator was not slow in making capital of McIver's statements. The factory owner depended upon the suffering of the women and children to force the workmen to yield to him. Jake Vodell, the self-appointed savior of the laboring people, depended upon the suffering of women and children to drive his followers to the desperate measures that would further his peculiar and personal interests. Through all this, the Mill Workers' Union still refused to accept the leadership of this man whose every interest was anti-American and foreign to the principles of the loyal citizen workman. But the fire of Jake Vodell's oratory and argument was not without kindling power, even among John Ward's employees. As the feeling on both sides of the controversy grew more bitter and intolerant, the mill men felt with increasing force the pull of their class. The taunts and jeers of the striking workers were felt. The cries of "traitor" hurt. The suffering of the innocent members of the strikers' families appealed strongly to their sympathies. When McIver's imperialistic declaration was known, the number who were in favor of supporting Jake Vodell's campaign increased measurably. Nearly every day now, at some hour of the evening or night, Pete and Captain Charlie, with others from among their Union comrades, might have been found in the hut on the cliff in earnest talk with the man in the wheelchair. The active head of the Union was Captain Charlie, as his father had been before him, but it was no secret that the guiding counsel that held the men of the mill steady came from the old basket-maker. For John Ward, the days were increasingly hard. He could not but sense the feeling of the men. He knew that if Jake Vodell could win them, such disaster as the people of Millsburg had never seen would result. The interest and sympathy of Helen, the comradeship of Captain Charlie, and the strength of the interpreter gave him courage and hope, but there was nothing that he could do. He felt as he had felt sometimes in France when he was called upon to stand and wait. It was a relief to help Mary as he could in her work among the sufferers. But even this activity of mercy was turned against him by both McIver and Vodell. The factory man blamed him for prolonging the strike and thus working injury to the general business interest of Millsburg. The strike leader charged him with seeking to win the favor of the working class in order to influence his own employees against what he called the fight for their industrial freedom. The situation was rapidly approaching a crisis when Peter Martin and Captain Charlie, returning home from a meeting of their union late one evening, found the door of the house locked. The way the two men stood facing each other without a word revealed the tension of their nerves. Captain Charlie's hand shook so that his key rattled against the lock. But when they were inside and had switched on the light, a note which Mary had left on the table for them explained. The young woman had gone to the flats in answer to a call for help. John was with her. She had left the note so that her father and brother would not be alarmed at her absence in case they returned home before her. In their relief, the two men laughed. They were a little ashamed of their unspoken fears. "We might have known," said Pete, and with the words seemed to dismiss the incident from his mind. But Captain Charlie did not recover so easily. While his father found the evening paper and, settling himself in an easy chair by the table, cleaned his glasses and filled and lighted his pipe, the younger man went restlessly from room to room, turning on the lights, turning them off again, all apparently for no reason whatever. He finished his inspection by returning to the table and again picking up Mary's note. When he reread the message, he said slowly, "I thought John expected to be at the office tonight." Something in his son's voice caused the old workman to look at him steadily as he answered, "John probably came by on his way to the mill and dropped in for a few minutes." "I suppose so," returned Charlie. Then, "Father, do you think it wise for Sister to be so much with John?" The old workman laid aside his paper. "Why, I don't know. I hadn't thought much about it, son. It seems natural enough, considering the way you children were all raised together when you were youngsters." "It's natural enough, all right," returned Captain Charlie, and with a bitterness that was very unlike his usual self, he added, "That's the hell of it. It's too natural, too human, too right for this day and age." Peter Martin's mind worked rather slowly, but he was fully aroused now. Charlie's meaning was clear. "What makes you think that Mary and John are thinking of each other in that way, son?" "How could they help it?" returned Captain Charlie. "Sister's exactly the kind of woman that John would choose for a wife. Don't I know what he thinks of the light-headed non-entities in the set that he's supposed to belong to? Hasn't he demonstrated his ideas of class distinctions? It would never occur to him that there's any reason why John Ward should not love Mary Martin. As for Sister, when you think of the whole story of their childhood together, of how John and I were all through the war, of how he has been in the mill since we came home, of their seeing each other here at the house so much, of the way he's been helping her with her work among the poor in the flats, well, how could any woman like Sister help loving him?" While the older man was considering his son's presentation of the case, Captain Charlie added with characteristic loyalty, "God may have made finer men than John Ward, but if he did, they don't live around Millsburg." "Well then, son," said Peter Martin with his slow smile, "what about it? Suppose they are thinking of each other as you say?" Captain Charlie did not answer for a long minute, and the father, watching, saw in that strong young face the shadow of a hurt which the soldier workman could not hide. "It's all so hopeless," said Charlie at last, in a tone that told more clearly than words could have done his own hopelessness. It don't seem right for Mary to have to bear it, too." "I'm sorry, son," was all the old workman said. But Captain Charlie knew that his father understood. After that they did not speak until they heard an automobile stop in front of the house. "That must be Mary now," said Pete, looking at his watch. "They've never been so late before." They heard her step on the porch. The sound of the automobile died away in the distance. When Mary came in and they saw her face, they knew that Charlie was right. She tried to return their greetings in her usual manner, but failed pitifully and hurried on to her room. The two men looked at each other without a word. Presently Mary returned and told them a part of her evening's experience. Soon after her father and brother had left the house for the meeting of their union, a boy from the flats came with the word that the wife of one of Jake Vodell's followers was very ill. Mary, knowing this desperate need of the case, but fearing to be alone in that neighborhood at night, had telephoned John at the mill, and he had taken her in his car to the place. The woman, in the agonies of childbirth, was alone with her 3 little girls. The husband and father was somewhere helping Jake Vodell in the agitator's noble effort to bring happiness to the laboring class. While Mary was doing what she could in the wretched home, John went for a doctor and to bring fuel and blankets and food and the other things that were needed. But in spite of their efforts, the fighting methods of McIver and Vodell scored another point, that they each might claim with equal reason, as in his favor, to God knows what end. "I can't understand why you mill men let them go on," Mary cried with a sudden outburst of feeling as she finished her story. "You could fight for the women and children during the war. Whenever there's a shipwreck, the papers are always full of the heroism of the men who cry, 'Women and children first.' Why can't someone think of the women and children in these strikes? They're just as innocent as the women and children of Belgium. Why don't you talk on the streets and hold mass meetings and drive Jake Vodell and that beast McIver out of the country?" "Jake Vodell and McIver are hoping that someone will do just that, Mary," returned Captain Charlie. "They would like nothing better than for someone to start a riot. You see, dear, an open clash would result in bloodshed. The troops would be called in by McIver, which is exactly what he wants. Vodell would provoke an attack on the soldiers. Someone would be killed, and we would have exactly the sort of war against the government that he and his brotherhood are working for." The old workman spoke. "Charlie is right, daughter. These troubles will never be settled by McIver's way nor Vodell's way. They will be settled by the employers like John and driving the McIvers out of business, and the employees like Charlie here and a lot of the men of our union getting together with John and his crowd and sending the Jake Vodells back to whatever country they came from." When her father spoke John's name, the young woman's face colored with a quick blush. The next moment, unable to control her overwrought emotions, she burst into tears and started to leave the room. But at the door Captain Charlie caught her in his arms and held her close until the first violence of her grief was over. When she had a little of her usual calmness, her brother whispered, "I know all about it, dear." She raised her head from his shoulder and looked at him with tearful doubt. "You know about John?" she said, wonderingly. "Yes," he whispered with an encouraging smile. "I know. Father and I were talking about it before you came home. I'm going to leave you with him now. You must tell Father, you know. Good night, dear. Good night, Father." Slowly, Mary turned back into the room. The old workman, sitting there in his big chair, held out his arms. With a little cry, she ran to him as she had gone to him all the years of her life. When she had told him all, how John that very evening on their way home from the flats had asked her to be his wife, and how she, in spite of her love for him, had forced herself to answer no, Pete Martin sat with his head bowed as one deep in thought. Mary, knowing her father's slow way, waited. When the old workman spoke at last, it was almost as though unconscious of his daughter's presence. He talked to himself. "Your mother and I used to think in the old days, when you children were growing up together, that sometime perhaps the two families would be united. But when we watched Adam getting rich and saw what his money was doing to him and to his home, we got to be rather glad that you children were separated. We were so happy ourselves in our own little home here that we envied no man. We did not want wealth even for you and Charlie when we saw all that went with it. We did not dream that Adam's success could ever stand in the way of our children's happiness like this. But I guess that is the way it is, daughter. I remember the interpreter saying once that no man had a right to make even himself miserable, because no man could be miserable alone." The old workman's voice grew still more reflective. It was the new process that made Adam rich. He was no better man at the bench than I. I never considered him as my superior. He happened to be born with a different kind of brain, that is all. And he thought more of money, while I cared more for other things. But there is a good reason why his money should not be permitted to stand between his children and my children. There's a lot of truth, after all, in Jake Vodell's talk about the rights of men who work with their hands. The law upholds Adam Ward and his possessions, I know, and it would uphold him just the same if my children were starving. But the law don't make it right. There should be some way to make a man do what is right, law or no law. You and John—" "Father," cried Mary, alarmed at his words, "surely you're not going to hold with Jake Vodell about such things. What do you mean about making a man do what is right, law or no law?" "There, there, daughter," said the old man, smiling. "I was just thinking out loud, I guess. It will be all right for you and John. Run along to bed now, and don't let worry come, even into your dreams." "I would rather give John up 1,000 times than have you like Jake Vodell," she said. "You shan't even think that way." When she was gone, Peter Martin filled and lighted his pipe again, and for another hour sat alone. Whether or not his thoughts bore any relation to the doctrines of Jake Vodell, they led the old workman on the following day to pay a visit to Adam Ward at his home on the hill. End of chapter 21. Book 3, Chapter 22 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 22, Old Friends. It was Sunday morning, and the church bells were ringing over the little city as the old workman climbed the hill to Adam Ward's estate. There was a touch of frost in the air. The hillside back of the interpreter's hut was brown. But the sun was bright and warm, and in every quarter of the city the people were going to their appointed places of worship. The voice of the mill was silenced. Pete wondered if he would find Adam at home. He had not thought about it when he left the cottage. His mind had been so filled with the object of his visit to the man who had once been his working comrade and friend. But Adam Ward was not at church. The mill owner's habits of worship were very simply regulated. If the minister said things that pleased him and showed a properly humble gratification at Adam's presence in the temple of God, Adam attended divine services. If the reverend teacher in the pulpit so far forgot himself as to say anything that jarred Adam's peculiar spiritual sensitiveness, or failed to greet this particular member of his flock with proper deference, Adam stayed at home and stopped his subscription to the cause. Nor did he ever fail to inform his pastor and the officers of the congregation as to the reason for his non-attendance, always at the time assuring them that whenever the minister would preach the truths that he wanted to hear, his weekly offerings to the Lord would be renewed. Thus Adam Ward was just and honest in his religious life as he was in his business dealings. He was ready always to pay for that which he received, but as a matter of principle, he was careful always to receive exactly what he paid for. This Sunday morning, Adam Ward was at home. When Pete reached the entrance to the estate, the heavy gates were closed. As Mary's father stood in doubt before the iron barrier, a man appeared on the inside. "Good morning, Uncle Pete," he said in hearty greeting when he saw who it was that sought admittance. "Good morning, Henry. And what are you doing in there?" returned the workman, who had known the man from his boyhood. The other grinned. "Oh, I'm one of the guards at this institution now." Pete looked at him blankly. "Guards? What are you guarding, Henry?" Standing close to the iron bars of the gate, Henry glanced over his shoulder before he answered in a low, cautious tone, "Adam." The old workman was shocked. "What? You don't mean it." He shook his grizzly head sadly. "I hadn't heard that he was that bad." Henry laughed. "We're not keeping the old boy in, Uncle Pete. Not yet. So far, our orders are only to keep people out. Dangerous people, I mean. The kind that might want to run away with the castle, or steal a look at the fountain, or sneak a smell of the flowers or something. You understand?" Pete smiled. "How do you like your job, Henry?" "Oh, it's all right just now when the strike is on. But was you wanting to come in, Uncle Pete, or just passing by?" "I wanted to see Adam if I could." The man swung the gate open. "Help yourself, Uncle Pete, just so you don't stick a knife into him or blow him up with a bomb or poison him or something." He pointed toward that part of the grounds where Helen had watched her father from the arbor. "You'll find him over there somewhere, I think. I saw him headed that way a few minutes ago. The rest of the family are gone to church." "Is Adam's life really threatened, Henry?" asked Pete as he stepped inside and the gates were closed behind him. "Search me," returned the guard indifferently. "I expect if the truth were known, it ought to be by rights. He sure enough thinks it is, though. Well, Uncle Pete, there can't be a butterfly flit over these grounds that Adam ain't a-yelling how there's an aeroplane a-sailing around looking for a chance to drop a monkey wrench on his head or something." "Poor Adam," murmured the old workman. "What a way to live." "Live?" echoed the guard. "It ain't living at all. It's just being in hell before your time. That's what it is, if you ask me." When Peter Martin, making his slow way up through the beautiful grounds, first caught sight of his old benchmate, Adam was pacing slowly to and fro across a sunny open space of lawn. As he walked, the mill owner was talking to himself and moving his arms and hands in those continuous gestures that seemed so necessary to any expression of his thoughts. Once Pete heard him laugh, and something in the mirthless sound made the old workman pause. It was then that Adam saw him. There was no mistaking the sudden fear that for a moment seemed to paralyze the man. His gray face turned a sickly white. His eyes were staring, his jaw dropped, his body shook as if with a chill. He looked about as if he would call for help, and started as if to seek safety in flight. "Good morning, Adam Ward," said Pete Martin. And at the gentle kindliness in the workman's voice, Adam's manner, with a suddenness that was startling, changed. With an elaborate show of friendliness, he came eagerly forward. His gray face, twitching with nervous excitement, beamed with joyous welcome. As he hurried across the bit of lawn between them, he waved his arms and rubbed his hands together in an apparent ecstasy of gladness at this opportunity to receive such an honored guest. His voice trembled with high-pitched assurance of his happiness in the occasion. He laughed as one who could not contain himself. "Well, well, well, to think that you have actually come to see me at last." He grasped the workman's hand in both his own with a grip that was excessive in its hearty energy. With affectionate familiarity, he almost shouted, "You old scoundrel! I can't believe it's you. Where have you been keeping yourself? How are Charlie and Mary? Lord, but it's good to see you here in my own home like this." While Pete was trying to make some adequate reply to this effusive and startling reception, Adam looked cautiously about to see if there were any chance observers lurking near. Satisfied that no one was watching, he said nervously, "Come on, let's sit over here where we can talk." And with his hand on Pete's arm, he led his caller to lawn chairs that were in the open, well beyond hearing of any curious ear in the shrubbery. Giving the workman opportunity for no more than an occasional monosyllable in reply, he poured forth a flood of information about his estate, the architectural features of his house, the cost, the loveliness of his trees, the cost, the coloring of his flowers, the cost, the magnificence of his view, and all the while he studied his caller's face with sharp, furtive glances, trying to find some clue to the purpose of the workman's visit. Peter Martin's steady eyes, save for occasional glances at the objects of Adam's interest as Adam pointed them out, were fixed on the mill owner with a half-wondering, half-pitying expression. Adam's evident nervousness increased. He talked of his mill, how he had built it up from nothing almost to its present magnitude, of the city and what he had done for the people. The old workman listened without comment. At last, apparently unable to endure the suspense a moment longer, Adam Ward said nervously, "Well, Pete, out with it. What do you want? I can guess what you're here for. We might as well get done with it." In his slow, thoughtful manner of speech that was so different from the mill owner's agitated expressions, the old workman said, "I have wanted for nothing, Adam. We've been contented and happy in our little home. But now," he paused as if his thoughts were loath to form themselves into words. The last vestige of pretense left Adam Ward's face as suddenly as if he had literally dropped a mask. "It's a good thing you've been satisfied," he said coldly. "You'd better continue to be. You know that you owe everything you have in the world to me. You need not expect anything more. Have you not made a big profit at every hour's work that I have done in your mill, Adam?" "Whatever profit I have or have not made on your work is none of your business, sir," retorted Adam. "I've given you a job all these years. I could have thrown you out. You haven't a thing on earth that you did not buy with the checks you received from me. I've worn myself out. made an invalid of myself building up the business that has enabled you and the rest of my employees to make a living. Every cent that I ever received from that new process I put back into the mill. You have had more out of it than I ever did." Peter Martin looked slowly about at the evidence of Adam Ward's wealth. When he again faced the owner of the estate, he spoke as if doubting that he had heard him clearly. "But the mill is yours, Adam," he said at last, "and all this is yours. Where did it come from?" "Certainly the mill is mine. Didn't I make it what it is? As for the place here, it came from the profits of my business, of course. You know I was nothing but a common workman when I started out." "I know," returned Pete, "and it was the new process that enabled you to get control of the mill, to buy it and build it up, wasn't it? If you hadn't happened to have had the process, the mill would have made all this for someone else, wouldn't it? We never dreamed that the process would grow into such a big thing for anybody when we used to talk it over in the old days, did we, Adam?" Adam Ward looked cautiously around at the shrubbery that encircled the bit of lawn. There was no one to be seen within hearing distance. When he faced his companion again, the mill owner's eyes were blazing, but he controlled his voice by a supreme effort of will. "Look here, Pete, I'm not going even to discuss that matter with you. I've kept you on at the mill and taken care of you all these years because of our old friendship and because I was sorry for you. But if you don't appreciate what I've done for you, if you attempt to start any talk or anything, I'll throw you and Charlie out of your jobs tomorrow. And I'll fix it, too, so you will never, either of you, get another day's work in Millsburg. That process is my property. No one has any interest in the patents in any way. I have it tied up so tight that all the courts in the world couldn't take it away from me. Law is law, and I propose to keep what the law says is mine. I have thousands of dollars to spend in defense of my legal rights where you have dimes. You needn't whine about moral obligations either. The only obligations that are of any force in business are legal. If you haven't brains enough to look after your own interests, you can't expect anyone else to look after them for you." When Adam Ward finished, his countenance was distorted with hate and fear. Before this simple, kindly old workman in whose honest soul there was no shadow of a wish to harm anyone in any way, the mill owner was like a creature of evil at bay. "I did not come to talk of the past, Adam Ward," said Pete sadly, "and I didn't come to threaten you or to ask anything for myself." At the gentle sadness of his old friend's manner and words, Adam's eyes gleamed with vicious triumph. "Well, out with it," he demanded harshly. "What are you here for?" "Your boy and my girl love each other, Adam." An ugly grin twisted the gray lips of Pete's employer. But Mary's father went on as though he had not seen. "The children were raised together, Adam. I've always thought of John almost as if he were my own son. It seems exactly right that he should want Mary and that she should want him. There's no man in the world I would rather it would be." Adam listened, still grinning as the old workman continued in his slow, quiet speech. "I never cared before for all that the new process made for you. You wanted money, I didn't. But it don't seem right that what you have, considering how you got it, should stand in the way of Mary's happiness. I understand that there's nothing I can do about it, but I thought that, considering everything, you might be willing to—" Adam Ward laughed aloud, laughed until the tears of his insane glee filled his eyes. "So that's your game," he said at last when he could speak. "You hadn't brains enough to protect yourself to start out with, and you found out that you haven't a chance in the world against me in the courts. So you try to make it by setting your girl up to catch John." "You must stop that sort of talk, Adam Ward," Peter Martin was on his feet, and there was that in his usually stolid countenance which made the mill owner shrink back. "I was a fool, as you say, but my mistake was that I trusted you. I believed in your pretended friendship for me. I thought you were honest and honorable as you seemed to be. I didn't know that your religion was all such a rotten sham. I've never cared that you grew rich while I remained poor. All these years I've been sorry for you because I've had so much of the happiness and contentment and peace that you've lost. But you must understand, sir, that there are some things that I will do in defense of my children that I would not do in defense of myself." Adam, white with trembling, drew farther away. "Be careful," he cried. "I can call a dozen men before you can move." Pete continued as if the other had not spoken. "There's no reason in the world why John and Mary should not marry." Adam Ward's insane hatred for the workman and his evil joy over this opportunity to make his old comrade suffer was stronger even than his fear. With another snarling laugh, he retorted viciously, "There's the best reason in the world why they will never marry. I am the reason, Pete Martin, and I'd like to see you try to do anything about it." Mary's father answered slowly, "I do not understand your hatred for me, Adam. All these years I've been loyal to you. I've never talked of our affairs to anyone." Adam interrupted him with a burst of uncontrollable rage. "Talk, you fool! Talk all you please. Tell anybody anything you like. Who will believe you? You will not only get yourself laughed at for being the short-sighted idiot you were. That process is patented in my name. I own it. You don't need to keep still on my account, but I tell you again that if you do try to start anything, I'll ruin you and I'll ruin your children." Suddenly, as if in fear that his rage would carry him too far, his manner changed, and he spoke with forced coldness. "I'm sorry that I cannot continue this interview, Pete. You have all that you will ever get from me, children or no children. Go on about your business as usual, and you may hold your job in the mill as long as you're able to do your work. I had thought that I might give you some sort of little pension when you got too old to keep up your end with the rest of the men." And then Adam Ward added the crowning, insolent expression of his insane and arrogant egotism. With a pious smirk of his gray, twitching face, he said, "I want you to know, Pete, that you can approach me any time without any feeling of humiliation." He turned abruptly away, and a moment later the old workman, watching, saw him disappear behind some tall bushes. As Pete Martin went slowly back to the entrance gate, he did not know that the owner of the estate was watching him. From bush to bush, Adam crept with the stealthy care of a wild creature following its prey, never taking his eyes from his victim, save for quick glances here and there to see that he himself was not observed. Not until Pete had passed from sight down the hill road did Adam appear openly. Then, going to the watchman at the gate, he berated him for admitting the old workman and threatened him with the loss of his position if he so offended again. When Peter Martin arrived home, he found Jake Vodell and Charlie discussing the industrial situation. The strike leader had come once more to try to enlist the support of the old workman and his son in his war against the employer class. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 23, A Last Chance. Jake Vodell greeted the old workman cordially, "You've been to church this fine morning, I suppose, eh?" he said with a sneering laugh that revealed how little his interview with Captain Charlie was contributing to his satisfaction. "No," returned Pete, "I did not attend church this morning. I do go, though, generally." "Oh, you worship the God of your good master Adam Ward, I suppose." But Pete Martin was in no way disturbed by the man's sarcasm. "No," he said slowly, "I do not think that Adam and I worship the same God." "Is it so? But when the son goes to war so bravely and fights for his masters, one would expect the father to say his prayers to his master's God, eh?" Captain Charlie retorted sharply. "The men who fought in the war fought for this nation, for every citizen in it. We fought for McIver just as we fought for Sam Whaley. Our loyalty in this industrial question is exactly the same. We will save the industries of this country for every citizen alike, because our national life is at stake. Did you ever hear of a sailor refusing to man the pumps on a sinking ship because the vessel was not his personal property?" "Bah!" growled Jake Vodell. "Your profession of loyalty to your country amuses me. Your country. It's McIver's country, Adam Ward's country. It is McIver's country, Adam Ward's country, I tell you. It is my little band of live, aggressive heroes who are the loyal ones. We're the ones who will save the industries, but we will save them for the laboring people alone. And you shirkers in your mill workers' union are willing to stand aside and let us do your fighting for you. Have you no pride for your class at all?" "Oh, yes," returned Captain Charlie. "We have plenty of class pride. Only you see, Vodell, we don't consider ourselves in your class. You're no more loyal to the principles of our American unions than you are to the principles of our government. You don't represent our unions. You represent something foreign to the interest of every American citizen. You are trying to use our unions in your business, that's all. And because you managed to get hold of a few poor fellows like Sam Whaley, you think you can lead the working people. If you really think our loyalty to our country is a joke, drop in at an American Legion meeting some evening. Bring along your foreign flag and all your foreign friends. I'll promise you a welcome that will, I think, convince you that we have some class pride after all." The agitator rose heavily to his feet. "It is your friendship with this John Ward that makes you turn from your own class. I've known how it would be with you. But it is no matter. We shall see. We will make a demonstration in Millsburg that will win the men of your union in spite of you and your crippled old basket maker. If you had a personal grievance against Adam Ward, as so many others have, you would be with me fast enough. But he and his son have made you blind with their pretended kindness." Pete Martin spoke now with a dignity and pride that moved Captain Charlie deeply. "Mr. Vodell, you are wrong. My son is too big to be influenced in this matter by any personal consideration. Whatever there is that is personal between Charlie and John or between Adam Ward and myself will never be brought into this controversy." Jake Vodell shrugged his heavy shoulders. "Very well. I'll go now. You will see that in the end the working people will know who are for their interest and who are against them, and we will know, too, how to reward our friends and punish our enemies. I'm sorry. I've given you today your last chance. You have a pretty little place here, eh?" There was a look in his dark face as he gazed about appraisingly that made Captain Charlie go a step toward him. "You have given us our last chance? Is this a sample of the freedom you offer so eloquently to the people? Instead of the imperialist McIver, we're to have the imperialist Vodell, are we? Between the two of you, I prefer McIver. He is at least sane enough to be constructive in his imperialism. My father and I have lived here all our lives, as most of our neighbors have. The majority of the workmen in this community own their homes just as we do. We are a part of the life of this city. What have you at stake? Where is your home and family? What is your nationality? What is your record of useful industry? Before you talk about giving a last chance to workmen like my father, you will need to produce the credentials of your authority. We have your number, Jake Vodell. You may as well go back to the land where you belong, if you belong anywhere on earth. You will never hang your colors in the Union Mill Workers' Hall. We have a flag there that now suits us. The chance you offer, last or first, is too darn big a chance for any sane American workman to monkey with. Jake Vodell answered harshly as he turned to go. At least I know now for sure who it is that makes the mill workers such traitors to their class. He looked at Pete. Your son has made his position very clear. We shall see now how bravely the noble captain will hold his ground. As for you, well, always the old father can pray to his God for his son. It is so, eh? Quickly the man passed through the white gate and disappeared down the street toward the flats. I'm afraid that fellow means trouble, son, said Pete slowly. Trouble, echoed Captain Charlie. Jake Vodell has never meant anything but trouble. Adam Ward did not join his family when they returned from church. A nervous headache kept him in his room. In the afternoon, John went for a long drive into the country. He felt that he must be alone, that he must think things out for both Mary and himself. As he looked back on it all now, it seemed to him that he had always loved this girl companion of his old house days. In his boyhood, he had accepted her as a part of his daily life, just as he had accepted his sister. Those years of his schooling had been careless, thoughtless years, and followed as they were by his war experience, they seemed now to have had so small a part in the whole that they scarcely counted at all. His renewed comradeship with Charlie in the army had renewed also, through the letters that Charlie always shared with him, his consciousness of Mary. In the months just past, his love had ripened and become a definite thing, fixed and certain in his own mind and heart as the fact of life itself. He had no more thought of accepting as final Mary's answer than he had of turning the management of the mill over to Jake Vodell or to Sam Whaley, but still they were things that he must think out. On that favorite hillside spot where he and Charlie had spent so many hours discussing their industrial problems, John faced squarely the questions raised by Mary's no. Through the chill of the fall twilight, John went home to spend the evening with his mother. But he did not speak to her of Mary. He could not somehow in the house that was so under the shadow of that hidden thing. His father was still in his room. On his way to his own apartment after his mother had retired, John stopped at his father's door to knock gently and ask if there was anything that he could do. The answer came, "No, I will be all right. Let me alone." Later, Helen returned from somewhere with McIver. Then John heard McIver leaving and Helen going to her mother for their usual good-night visit. Seeing the light under his door as she passed, she tapped the panel and called softly that it was time all good little boys were fast asleep. It was an hour, perhaps, after John had gone to bed, that he was awakened by the sound of someone stealing quietly into his room. Against the dim night light in the hall, he caught the outline of an arm and shoulder as the intruder carefully closed the door. Reaching out to the lamp at the head of his bed, He snapped on the light and sprang to his feet. "Father!" "Shh! Be careful, John. They will hear you." Adam Ward's gray face was ghastly with nervous excitement and fear, and he was shaking as with a chill. "No one must know I told you," he whispered. "But the new process is the source of everything we have, the mill and everything. If it wasn't for my patent rights, we would have nothing. You and I would be working in the mill just like Pete and his boy." John spoke soothingly. "Yes, Father, I understand. But it will be all right. I'll take care of it." Adam chuckled. "They're after it, but I've got it all sewed up so tight they can't touch it. That old fool Pete was here to feel me out today." "Pete here?" Adam grinned. "While you folks were at church." "And what did he want, Father?" "They've got a new scheme now. They've set Mary after you. They figure that if the girl can land you, they'll get a chance at what I've made out of the process that way. I told him you were too smart to be caught like that, but you've got to watch them. They'll do anything." In spite of his pity for his father, John Ward drew from him, overcome by a feeling of disgust and shame which he could not wholly control. Adam, unconscious of his son's emotions, went on. "I've made it all in spite of them, John, but I've had to watch them. They'll be after you now that I've turned things over to you, just as they've been after me. They'll never get it, though. They'll never get a penny of it. I'll destroy the mill and everything before I'll give up $1 of what I've made." John Ward could not speak. It was too monstrous, too horrible. As one in a hideous dream he listened. What was back of it all? Why did his father, in his spells of nervous excitement, always rave so about the patented process? Why did he hate Pete Martin so bitterly? What was this secret thing that was driving Adam Ward insane? Thinking to find an answer to these perplexing questions, if there was any answer other than the mill owner's mental condition, John forced himself to the pretense of sharing his father's fears. He agreed with Adam's arraignment of Pete, echoed his father's expression of hatred for the old workman, thanked Adam for warning him, boasted of his own ability to see through their tricks and schemes and to protect the property his father had accumulated. In this vein they talked in confidential whispers until John felt that he could venture the question. "Just what is it about the process that they're after, Father? If I knew the exact history of the thing, I would be in a much better position to handle the situation as you want, wouldn't I?" Adam Ward's manner changed instantly. With a look of sly cunning, he studied John's face. "There is nothing about the process, son," he said steadily. "You know all there is to know about it now." But when John, thinking that his father had regained his self-control, urged him to go back to bed, Adam's painful agitation returned. For some moments he paced to and fro, as if in nervous indecision. Then, going close to John, he said in a low half-whisper, "John, there's something else I wanted to ask you. You've been to college and over there in the war. You must have seen a lot of men die." He paused. Yes, you must have been close to death a good many times. Tell me, John, do you believe that there's anything after? Anything beyond this life? Does a man's conscious existence go on when he's dead?" "Yes," said John, wondering at this apparent change in his father's thought. "I believe in a life beyond this. You believe in it too, don't you, Father?" "Of course," returned Adam. "We can't know, though, for sure, can we? But anyway, a man would be foolish to risk it, wouldn't he?" "To risk what, Father?" "To risk the chance of there being no hell," came the startling answer. My folks raised me to believe in hell, and the preachers all teach it. And if there should be such a place of eternal torment, a man would be a fool not to fix up some way to get out of it, wouldn't he?" John did not know what to say. Adam Ward leaned closer to his son and with an air of secrecy whispered, "That's exactly what I've done, John. I've worked out a scheme to tie God up in a contract that will force him to save me. The old interpreter gave me the idea. You see, if it should turn out that there's no hell, my plan can't do any harm. And if there is a hell, it makes me safe anyway." He chuckled with insane satisfaction. "They say that God knows everything, that nobody can figure out a way to beat him. But I have. I've worked out a deal with God that is bound to give me the best of it. I've got him tied up so tight that he'll be bound to save me. Some people think I'm crazy, but you wait, my boy. They'll find out how crazy I am. They'll never get me into hell. I've been figuring on this ever since the interpreter told me I'd better make a contract with God. And after Pete left this morning, I got it all settled. A man can't afford to take any chances with God, and so I made this deal with him. Hell or no hell, I'm safe. God don't get the best of me. And you're safe too, son, with the new process, if you look after your own interest as I've done, and don't overlook any opportunities. I wanted to tell you about this so you wouldn't worry about me. I'll go back to bed now. Don't tell Mother and Helen what we've been talking about. No use to worry them. They couldn't understand anyway. And don't forget, John, what Pete told me about Mary. Their scheme won't work, of course. I know you're too smart for them. But just the same, you've got to be on your guard against her all the time. Never take any unnecessary chances. Don't talk over a deal with a man when anyone can hear. If you're careful to have no witnesses when you arrange a deal, you're absolutely safe. It's what you can slip into the written contract that counts once you get your man's signature. That's always been my way, and now I've even put one over on God." He stole cautiously out of the room and back to his own apartment. Outside his father's door, John waited, listening, until he was convinced that sleep had at last come to the exhausted man. Late that same Sunday evening, when the street meeting held by Jake Vodell was over, there was another meeting in the room back of the pool hall. The men who sat around that table with the agitator were not criminals. They were workmen. Sam Whaley and two others were men with families. They were all American citizens, but they were under the spell of their leader's power. They had been prepared for that leadership by the industrial policies of McIver and Adam Ward. This meeting of that inner circle was in no way authorized by the unions. The things they said Sam Whaley would not have dared to say openly in the mill workers' organization. The plans they proposed to carry out in the name of the unions they were compelled to make in secret. In their mad, fanatical acceptance of the dreams that Vodell wrought for them, in their blind obedience to the leadership he had so cleverly established, in their reckless disregard of the consequences under the spell of his promised protection, they were as insane, in fact, as the owner of the mill himself. The supreme, incredible, pitiful tragedy of it all was this, that these workmen committed themselves to the plans of Jake Vodell in the name of their country's workmen. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 24, The Flats. Helen Ward knew that she could not put off much longer giving McIver a definite answer. When she was with him, the things that so disturbed her mind and heart were less real. She was able to see things clearly from the point of view to which she had been trained. Her father's mental condition was nothing more than a nervous trouble resulting from overwork. John's ideals were highly creditable to his heart, and she loved him dearly for them, but they were wholly impossible in a world where certain class standards must be maintained. The mill took again its old, vague, indefinite place in her life. The workman Charlie Martin must live only in her girlhood memories, those secretly sad memories that can have no part in the grown-up present and must not be permitted to enter into one's consideration of the future. In short, the presence of McIver always banished effectually the Helen of the old house. With him, the daughter of Adam Ward was herself. And Helen was tempted by this feeling of relief to speak the decisive word that would finally put an end to her indecision and bring at least the peace of certainty to her troubled mind. In the light of her education and environment, there was every reason why she should say yes to McIver's insistent pleadings. There was no shadow of a reason why she should refuse him. One word, and the Helen of the old house would be banished forever. The princess lady would reign undisturbed. And yet, for some reason, that word was not spoken. Helen told herself that she would speak it, but on each occasion she put it off, and always when the man was gone and she was alone, in spite of the return in full force of all her disturbing thoughts and emotions, she was glad that she had not committed herself irrevocably, that she was still free. She had never felt the appeal of all that McIver meant to her as she felt it that Sunday. She had never been more disturbed and unhappy than she was the following day when John told her a little of his midnight experience with her father and how Adam's excitement had been caused by Peter Martin's visit, all of which led her, early in the afternoon, to the interpreter. She found the old basket-maker working with feverish energy. Billy Rand, at the bench in the corner of the room, was as busy with his part of their joint industry. It was the interpreter's habit, when Helen was with him, to lay aside his work. But of late he had continued the occupation of his hands even as he talked with her. She had noticed this, as women always notice such things, but that was all. On this day, when the old man in the wheelchair failed to give her his undivided attention, something in his manner impressed the trivial incident more sharply on her mind. He greeted her kindly as always, but while she was conscious of no lack of warmth in his welcome, she felt in the deep tones of that gentle voice a sadness that moved her to quick concern. The dark eyes that never failed to light with pleasure at her coming were filled with weary pain. The strong face was thin and tired. As he bent his white head over the work in his lap, he seemed to have grown suddenly very weak and old. With an awakened mind, the young woman looked curiously about the room. She had never seen it so filled with materials and with finished baskets. The table with the big lamp and the magazines and papers had been moved into the far corner against the bookshelves, as though he had now neither time nor thought for reading. The floor was covered thick with a litter of chips and shavings. Even Silent Billy's face was filled with anxiety and troubled care as he looked from Helen to his old companion in the wheelchair, and slowly turned back to his work on the bench. "What is the matter here?" she demanded, now thoroughly aroused. "Matter?" returned the interpreter. "Is there anything wrong here, Helen?" "You're not well," she insisted. You look all worn out, as if you had not slept for weeks. What is it?" "Oh, that is nothing," he answered with a smile. "Billy and I have been working overtime a little. That is all." "But why?" she demanded. "Why must you wear yourself out like this? Surely there's no need for you to work so hard, day and night." He answered as if he were not sure that he had heard her aright. "No need, Helen? Surely, child, you cannot be so ignorant of the want that exists within sight of your home." She returned his look wonderingly. "You mean the strike?" Bending over his work again, the old basket-maker answered sorrowfully, "Yes, Helen, I mean the strike." There was something in the interpreter's manner, something in the weary, drooping figure in that wheelchair, in the tired, deep-lined face, in the pain-filled eyes, and the gentle voice that went to the deeps of Helen Ward's woman's heart. With her, as with everyone in Millsburg, the strike was a topic of daily conversation. She sympathized with her brother in his anxiety. She was worried over the noticeable effect of the excitement upon her father. She was interested in McIver's talk of the situation. But in no vital way had her life been touched by the industrial trouble. In no way had she come in actual contact with it. The realities of the situation were to her vague, intangible, remote from her world, as indeed the mill itself had been, before her visit with John that day. To her, the interpreter was of all men set apart from the world. In his little hut on the cliff, with his books and his basket-making, her gentle old friend's life, it seemed to her, held not one thing in common with the busy world that lay within sight of the balcony porch. The thought that the industrial trouble could in any way touch him came to her with a distinct shock. "Surely," she protested at last, "the strike cannot affect you. It has nothing to do with your work." "Every strike has to do with all work everywhere, child," returned the man in the wheelchair, while his busy fingers wove the fabric of a basket. "Every idle hand in the world, Helen, whatever the cause of its idleness, compels some other's hand to do its work. The work of the world must be done, child, somehow, by someone. The work of the world must be done. The little Maggies and Bobbies of the flats down there must be fed, you know, and their mother, too. Yes, and Sam Whaley himself must be cared for. And so, you see, because of the strike, Billy and I must work overtime." Certainly there was no hint of rebuke in the old basket-maker's kindly voice, but the daughter of Adam Ward felt her cheeks flush with a quick sense of shame. That her old friend in the wheelchair should so accept the responsibility of his neighbor's need and give himself thus to help them, while she— "Is there," she faltered, "is there really so much suffering among the strikers?" Without raising his eyes from his work, he answered, "The women and children, they're so helpless." I did not realize," she murmured. "I did not know." "You were not ignorant of the helpless women and children who suffered in foreign lands," he returned. "Why should you not know of the mothers and babies in Millsburg?" "But McIver says—" She hesitated. The interpreter caught her words. "McIver says that by feeding the starving families of the strikers, the strike is prolonged. He relies upon the hunger and cold and sickness of the women and children for his victory. And Jake Vodell relies upon the suffering in the families of his followers for that desperate frenzy of class hatred without which he cannot gain his end. Does McIver want for anything? No. Is Jake Vodell in need? No. It is not the imperialistic leaders in these industrial wars who pay the price. It is always the little Bobbies and Maggies who pay. The people of America stood aghast with horror when an unarmed passenger ship was torpedoed or a defenseless village was bombed by order of a ruthless Kaiser. But we permit these Kaisers of capital and labor to carry on their industrial wars without a thought of the innocent ones who must suffer under their ruthless policies. He paused. Then, with no trace of bitterness, but only sadness in his voice, he added, "You say you don't know, child, and yet you could know so easily if you would. Little Bobby and Maggie do not live in a far-off land across the seas. They live right over there in the shadow of your father's mill, the mill which supplies you, Helen, with every material need and luxury of your life." As if she could bear to hear no more, Helen rose quickly and went from the room to stand on the balcony porch. It was not so much the interpreter's words, it was rather the spirit in which they were spoken that moved her so deeply. By her own heart she was judged. "For every idle hand," he had said. Her hands were idle hands. Her old white-haired friend in his wheelchair was doing her work. His crippled body drooped with weariness over his task because she did nothing. His face was lined with care because she was careless of the need that burdened him. His eyes were filled with sadness and pain because she was indifferent, because she did not know, had not cared to know. The sun was almost down that afternoon when Bobby Whaley came out of the wretched house that was his home to stand on the front doorstep. This dingy, unpainted building of the flats, the untidy hovels and shanties, the dilapidated fences and broken sidewalks, unlovely at best, in the long shadows of the failing day, were sinister with the gloom of poverty. High above the mill, the twisting columns of smoke from the tall stacks caught the last of the sunlight and formed slow, changing cloud shapes, rolling hills of brightness with soft, shadowy valleys and canyons of mysterious depths between, towering domes and crags and castled heights, grim, foreboding, beautiful. The boy who stood on the steps, looking so listlessly about, was not the daring adventurer who had so boldly led his sister up the zigzag steps to the interpreter's hut. He was not the Bobby who had ridden in such triumph beside the princess lady so far into the unknown country. His freckled face was thin and pinched. The skin was drawn tight over the high cheekbones, and the eyes were wide and staring. His young body that had been so sturdy was gaunt and skeleton-like. The dirty rags that clothed him were scarcely enough to hide his nakedness. The keen autumn air that had put the flush of good red blood into the cheeks of the golfers at the country club that afternoon whirled about his bare feet and legs with stinging cruelty. His thin lips and wasted limbs were blue with cold. Turning slowly, he seemed about to re-enter the house, but when his hand touched the latch, he paused and once more uncertainly faced toward the street. There was no help for him in his home. He knew no other place to go for food or shelter. As the boy again looked hopelessly about the wretched neighborhood, he saw a woman coming down the street. He could tell, even at that distance, that the lady was a stranger to the flats. Her dress, simple as it was, and her veil marked her as a resident of some district more prosperous than that grimy community in the shadow of the mill. A flash of momentary interest lighted the hungry eyes of the lad. But no, it could not be one of the charity workers. The charity ladies always came earlier in the day, and always in automobiles. Then he saw the stranger stop and speak to a boy in front of the house 2 doors away. The neighbor boy pointed toward Bobby, and the lady came on, walking quickly as if she were a little frightened at being alone amid such surroundings. At the gap where once had been a gate in the dilapidated fence, she turned in toward the house and the wondering boy on the front step. She was within a few feet of the lad when she stopped suddenly with a low exclamation. Bobby thought she had discovered her mistake in coming to the wrong place. But the next moment she was coming closer, and he heard, "Bobby, is that really you? You poor child. Have you been ill?" "I ain't been sick, if that's what you mean," returned the boy. "Mag is, though. She's worse today." His manner was sullenly defiant, as if the warmly dressed stranger had in some way revealed herself as his enemy. "Don't you know me, Bobby?" "Not with your face covered up like that, I don't." She laughed nervously and raised her veil. "Ah, it's you, is it? Funny, Mag's been a-talking about her princess lady all afternoon. What you doing here?" Before this hollow-cheeked skeleton of a boy, Helen Ward felt strangely like one who, conscious of guilt, is brought suddenly into the presence of a stern judge. "Why, Bobby," she faltered, I came to see you and Maggie. I was at the interpreter's this afternoon, and he told me, something he said made me want to come." "The interpreter, he's all right," said the boy. "So's Mary Martin." "Aren't you just a little glad to see me, Bobby?" The boy did not seem to hear. "Funny the way Mag talks about you all the time. She's pretty sick right now. Peterson's baby. It died." "Can't we go into the house and see Maggie? You must be nearly frozen standing out here in the cold." "Huh? I'm used to freezing. I guess you can come on in, though, if you want to. Maybe Mag'd like to see you." He pushed open the door, and she followed him into the ghastly barrenness of the place that he knew as home. Never before had the daughter of Adam Ward viewed such naked, cruel poverty. She shuddered with the horror of it. It was so unreal, so unbelievable. A small, rusty cook stove with no fire, a rude table with no cloth, a rickety cupboard with its shelves bare save for a few dishes, 2 broken-backed chairs. That was all. No, it was not all. On a window ledge, beneath a bundle of rags that filled the opening left by a broken pane, was a small earthen flower pot holding a single scraggly slip of geranium. Helen seemed to hear again the interpreter saying, "A girl with true instincts for the best things of life and the capacity for great happiness." At Bobby's call, Mrs. Whaley came from another room. The boy did not even attempt an introduction, but stood sullenly aside, waiting developments, and the mother in her pitiful distress evidently failed to identify their visitor when Helen introduced herself. "I'm pleased to meet you, ma'am," she said mechanically, and gazed at the young woman with a stony indifference, as though her mind, deadened by fearful anxiety and physical suffering, refused even to wonder at the stranger's presence in her home. Helen did not know what to say. In the presence of this living tragedy of motherhood, she felt so helpless, so overwhelmed with the uselessness of mere words. What right had she, a stranger from another world, to intrude unasked into the privacy of this home? And yet, something deep within her, something more potent in its authority than the conventionalities that had so far ruled her life, assured her that she had the right to be there. I called to see Bobby and Maggie," she faltered. "I met them, at the interpreter's." As if Helen's mention of the old basket-maker awakened a spark of life in her pain-deadened senses, the woman returned, "Yes, ma'am. Take a chair. No, not that one. It's broke. Here, this one will hold you up, I guess." With nervous haste, she dusted the chair with her apron. "You'd best keep your things on. We don't have no fire except to cook by, when there's anything to cook." She found a match and lighted a tiny lamp, for it was growing dark. "Bobby tells me that little Maggie is ill," offered Helen. Mrs. Whaley looked toward the door of that other room and wrung her thin, toil-worn hands in the agony of her mother's fear. "Yes, ma'am, she's real bad, I guess. Poor child, she's been ailing for some time, and since the strike—" Her voice broke, and her eyes, dry as if they had long since exhausted their supply of tears, were filled with hopeless misery. "We had a doctor once before things got so bad, about the time my man quit his work in the mill to help Jake Vodell it was. And the doctor, he said all she needed was plenty of good food and warm clothes and a chance to play in the fresh country air." She looked grimly about the bare room. "We couldn't have the doctor no more. I don't know as it would make any difference if we could. My man, he's away most of the time. I ain't seen him since yesterday morning, and today Maggie's been a lot worse. I'm afraid—" Helen wanted to cry aloud. Was it possible that she had asked the interpreter only a few hours before if there was really much suffering in the families of the strikers? "You can see Maggie if you want," said the mother. "She's in there." She rose as if to show her visitor to the room, but Helen said quickly, "In just a moment. Mrs. Whaley, won't you tell me first, is there no one to help you?" She asked the question timidly, as if fearing to offend. The other woman answered hopelessly, "The charity ladies do a little, and the interpreter and Mary Martin do all they can. But you see, ma'am, there's so many others just like us that there ain't near enough to go round." The significance of the woman's colorless words went to Helen's heart with appalling force. So many others just like us. This stricken home was not then an exception. With flashing vividness her mind pictured many rooms similar to the cold and barren apartment where she sat. She visioned as clearly as she saw Mrs. Whaley the many other wives and mothers with Bobbies and Maggies who were caught helplessly in the monstrous net of the strike as these were caught. She knew now why the interpreter and Billy Rand worked so hard. And again she felt her cheeks burn with shame, as when the old basket-maker had said, "For every idle hand—" Helen Ward had been an active leader in the foreign relief work during the war. Her portrait had even been published in the papers as one who was devoted to the cause of the stricken women and children abroad. But that had all been impersonal, while this— Already in her heart she was echoing the old familiar cry of the comparative few. If only the people knew, if only they could be made to see as she had been made to see. The people are not so cruel. They simply do not know. They are ignorant, as she was ignorant. Aloud she was saying to Bobby as she thrust her purse in the boy's hand, "You must run quickly, Bobby, to the nearest store and get the things that your mother needs first, and have someone telephone for a doctor to come at once." To the mother she added hurriedly, as if fearing a protest, "Please, Mrs. Whaley, let me help. I'm so sorry I did not know before. Won't you forgive me and let me help you now?" "Gee!" exclaimed Bobby, who had opened the purse. "Looky, Mom. Gee!" As one in a dream, the mother turned from the money in the boy's hand to Helen. "You ain't meaning, ma'am, for us to use all that?" "Yes, yes. Don't be afraid to get what you need. There will be more when that is gone." The poor woman did not fill the air with loud cries of hysterical gratitude. and superlative prayers to God for his blessing upon this one who had come so miraculously to their relief. For a moment she stood trembling with emotion, while her tearless eyes were fixed upon Helen's face with a look of such gratitude that the young woman was forced to turn away, lest her own feeling escape her control. Then, snatching the money from the boy's hands, she said, "I'd better go myself, ma'am. Bobby can come along to help carry things. If you—" she hesitated, with a look toward that other room. "If you wouldn't mind staying with Maggie till we get back." A minute later, and Helen was alone in that wretched house in the flats, alone save for the sick child in the next room. The door to the street had scarcely closed when a wave of terror swept over her. She started to her feet. She could not do it. She would call Mrs. Whaley back. She would go herself for the needed things. But there was a strength in Helen Ward that few of her most intimate friends even realized. And before her hand touched the latch of the door, she had command of herself once more. In much the same spirit that her brother John, perhaps, had faced a lonely night watch in Flanders Field, Adam Ward's daughter forced herself to do this thing that had so unexpectedly fallen to her. For some minutes she walked the floor, listening to the noises of the neighborhood. Anxiously she opened the door and looked out into the fast gathering darkness. No one of her own people knew where she was. She had heard terrible things of Jake Vodell and his creed of terrorism. McIver had pressed it upon her mind that the strikers were all alike in their lawlessness. What if Sam Whaley should return to find her there? She listened. A faint moaning sound came from the next room. She went quickly to the doorway, but in the faint light she could see only the shadowy outline of a bed. Taking the lamp, she entered fearfully. Save for the bed, an old box that served as a table and one chair, this room was as bare as the other. With the lamp in her hand, Helen stood beside the bed. The tiny form of little Maggie was lost under the ragged and dirty coverlet. The child's face, in the tangled mass of her unkempt hair, was so wasted and drawn, her eyes closed under their dark lids, so deeply sunken, and her teeth so exposed by the thin, fleshless lips that she seemed scarcely human. One bony arm with its claw-like hand encircled the rag doll that she had held that day when Helen took the two children into the country. As Helen looked, all her fears vanished. She had no thought now of where she was or how she came there. Deep within her she felt the awakening of that mother soul which lives in every woman. She did not shrink in horror from this hideous fruit of Jake Vodell's activity. She did not cry out in pity or sorrow. She uttered no word of protest. As she put the lamp down on the box, her hand did not tremble. Very quietly she placed the chair beside the bed and sat down to watch and wait, as motherhood in all ages has watched and waited. While poor Sam Whaley was busy on some mission assigned to him by his leader, Jake Vodell, and his wife and boy were gone for the food supplied by a stranger to this household, this woman, of the class that he had been taught to hate, held alone her vigil at the bedside of the workman's little girl. A thin, murmuring voice came from the bed. Helen leaned closer. She heard a few incoherent mutterings, then, "No, no, Bobby, you wouldn't dast blow up the castle. You'd maybe kill the princess lady. You know you couldn't do that." Again the weak little voice sank into low, meaningless murmurs. The tiny claw-like fingers plucked at the coverlet. "'Tain't so the princess lady will find her jewel of happiness, I tell you, Bobby, just like the interpreter told us, 'cause her heart is kind. You know her heart is kind. Silence again. Someone passed the house. A dog howled. A child in the house next door cried. Across the street a man's voice was raised in anger. Suddenly little Maggie's eyes opened wide. "And the princess lady is a-comin' some day to take Bobby and me away up in the sky to her beautiful palace place, where there's flowers and birds and everything all the time, and The big eyes were fixed on Helen's face as the young woman stooped over the bed, and the light of a glorious smile transformed the wasted childish figures. Why, you've come." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 25, McIver's Opportunity. When the politician stopped at the cigar stand late that afternoon for a box of the kind he gave his admirers, the philosopher, scratching the revenue label, remarked, "I see by the papers that McIver is still a-stayin'," grunted the politician with careful diplomacy. The bank clerk, who was particular about his pipe tobacco, chimed in, "McIver is a stayer, all right, when it comes to that." "Natural-born fighter, sir," offered the politician tentatively. "Game sport, McIver is," agreed the undertaker, taking the place at the showcase vacated by the departing bank clerk. The philosopher, handing out the newcomer's favorite smoke, echoed his customer's admiration. "You bet he's a game sport." He punched the cash register with vigor. "Don't give a hang what it cost the other fellow." The undertaker laughed. "I remember one time," said the philosopher, "McIver and a bunch was going fishing up the river. They stopped here early in the morning, and while they were getting their smokes, the judge, who's always handing out some sort of poetry stuff, you know, he says, 'Well, Jim, we're going to have a fine day anyway. No matter whether we catch anything or not, it will be worth the trip just to get out into the country. Mac,'" he looked at the judge a minute as if he wanted to bite him, "you know what I mean." Then he says in that growling voice of his, "That may be for you, all right, Judge, but I'm here to tell you that when I go fishing, I go for fish." The cigar store philosopher's story accurately described the dominant trait in the factoryman's character. To him, business was a sport, a game, a contest of absorbing interest. He entered into it with all the zest and strength of his virile manhood. Mind and body, it absorbed him. And yet he knew nothing of that true sportsman's passion which plays the game for the joy of the game itself. McIver played to win, not for the sake of winning, but for the value of the winnings. Methods were good or bad only as they won or lost. He was incapable of experiencing those larger triumphs which come only in defeat. The interpreter's philosophy of the oneness of all was to McIver the fanciful theory of an impracticable dreamer, who, too feeble to take a man's part in life, contented himself by formulating creeds of weakness that benefited his state. Men were the pieces with which he played his game. They were of varied values, certainly, as are the pieces on a chess table, but they were pieces on the chess table and nothing more. All of which does not mean that Jim McIver was cruel or unkind. Indeed, he was genuinely and generously interested in many worthy charities, and many a man had appealed to him, and not in vain, for help. But to have permitted these humanitarian instincts to influence his play in the game of business would have been, to his mind, evidence of a weakness that was contemptible. The human element, he held, must of necessity be sternly disregarded if one would win. While his fellow townsmen were discussing him at the cigar stand, and men everywhere in Millsburg were commenting on his determination to break the strikers to his will at any cost, McIver, at his office, was concluding a conference with a little company of his fellow employers. It was nearly dark when the conference finally ended, and the men went their several ways. McIver, with some work of special importance waiting his attention, telephoned that he would not be home for dinner. He would finish what he had to do and would dine at the club later in the evening. The big factory inside the high board fence was silent. The night came on. Save for the armed men who guarded the place, the owner was alone. Absorbed in his consideration of the business before him, the man was oblivious to everything but his game. An hour went by. He forgot that he had had no dinner. Another hour, and another. He was interrupted at last by the entrance of a guard. "Well, what do you want?" he said shortly, when the man stood before him. "There's a woman outside, sir. She insists that she must see you." "A woman?" "Yes, sir." "Who is she?" "I don't know." "Well, what does she look like?" "I couldn't see her face. She's got a veil on." The factory owner considered. How did anyone outside of his home know that he was in his office at that hour? These times were dangerous. "Vodell is likely to try anything," he said aloud. "Better send her about her business." "I tried to," the guard returned, "but she won't go. Says she's a friend of yours and has got to see you tonight." "A friend? Huh! How did she get here?" "In a taxi, and the taxi beat it as soon as she got out." Again McIver considered. Then his heavy jaw set, and he growled. "All right, bring her in, a couple of you, and see that you stand by while she's here. If this is a Vodell trick of some sort, I'll beat him to it." Helen, escorted by two burly guards, entered the office. McIver sprang to his feet with an exclamation of amazement, and his tender concern was unfeigned and very comforting to the young woman after the harrowing experience through which she had just passed. Sending the guards back to their posts, he listened gravely while she told him where she had been and what she had seen. "But, Helen," he cried when she had finished, "it was sheer madness for you to be alone in the flats like that, at Whaley's place, and in the night, too. Good heavens, girl, don't you realize what a risk you were taking?" "I had to go, Jim," she returned. "You had to go," he repeated. "Why?" "I had to see for myself if things were as bad as the interpreter said. Oh, can't you understand, Jim? I could not believe it. It all seemed so impossible. Don't you see that I had to know for sure?" "I see that someone ought to break that meddlesome old basket-maker's head as well as his legs," growled McIver indignantly. "The idea of sending you, Adam Ward's daughter of all people, alone into that nest of murdering anarchists." "But the interpreter didn't send me, Jim," she protested. "He did not even know that I was going. No one knew." "I understand all that," said McIver. "The interpreter didn't send you. Oh, no. He simply made you think that you ought to go. That's the way the tricky old scoundrel does everything, from what I'm told." She looked at him steadily. Do you think, Jim, the interpreter's way is such a bad way to get people to do things? Forgive me, he begged humbly, but it makes me wild to think what might have happened to you. It's all right now, though. I will take you home, and in the future you can turn such work over to the regular charity organizations. He was crossing the room for his hat and overcoat. Jove, I can't believe yet that you have actually been in such a mess, and all by your lonesome, too. She was about to speak when he stopped, and, as if struck by a sudden thought, said quickly, "But, Helen, you haven't told me. How did you know I was here?" She explained hurriedly. "The doctor sent a taxi for me, and I telephoned your house from a drugstore. Your man told me you expected to be late at the office and would dine at the club. I phoned the club, and when I learned that you were not there, I came straight on. I had to see you tonight, Jim, and I was afraid if I phoned here at the office, you wouldn't let me come." McIver evidently saw from her manner that there was still something in the amazing situation that they had not yet touched upon. Coming back to his desk, he said, "I don't think I understand, Helen. Why were you in such a hurry to see me? Besides, don't you know that I would have gone to you at once, anywhere?" "I know, Jim," she returned slowly, as one approaching a difficult subject. "But I couldn't tell you what I had seen. I couldn't talk to you about these things at home." "I understand," he said gently, "and I'm glad that you wanted to come to me. But you're tired and nervous and all unstrung now. Let me take you home, and tomorrow we will talk things over." As if he had not spoken, she said steadily, "I want to tell you about the terrible, terrible condition of these poor people, Jim. I thought you ought to know about them exactly as they are, and not in a vague, indefinite way, as I knew about them before I went to see for myself." The man moved uneasily. "I do know about the condition of these people, Helen. It is exactly what I expected would happen." She was listening carefully. "You expected them to be hungry and cold and sick like that, Jim?" "Such conditions are always a part of every strike like this," he returned. "There's nothing unusual about it, and it is the only thing that will ever drive these cattle back to their work. They simply have to be starved to it." "But John says—" he interrupted. "Please, Helen, I know all about what John says. I know where he gets it, too. He gets it from the interpreter, who gave you this crazy notion of going alone into the flats to investigate personally. And John's ideas are just about as practical." "But the mothers and children, Jim." "The men can go back to work whenever they're ready," he retorted. "At your terms, you mean?" she asked. "My terms are the only terms that will ever open this plant again. The unions will never dictate my business policies. If every family in Millsburg starves—" She waited a moment before she said slowly, "I must be sure that I understand, Jim. Do you mean that you're actually depending upon such pitiful conditions as I have seen tonight to give you a victory over the strikers?" The man made a gesture of impatience. "It is the principle of the thing that is at stake, Helen. If I yield in this instance, it would be only the beginning of a worse trouble. If the working class wins this time, there will be no end to their demands. We might as well turn all our properties over to them at once and be done with it. This strike in Millsburg is only a small part of the general industrial situation. The entire business interests of the country are involved." Again she waited a little before answering. Then she said sadly, "How strange. It is hard for me to realize, Jim, that the entire business interests of this great nation are actually dependent upon the poor little Maggie Whaley's." "Helen," he protested, You make me out a heartless brute." "No, Jim, I know you're not that. But when you insist that what I saw tonight, that the suffering of these poor, helpless mothers and their children is the only thing that will enable you employers to break this strike and save the business of the country, it does seem a good deal like the Germans' war policy of frightfulness that we all condemned so bitterly, doesn't it? These things are not matters of sentiment, Helen. Jake Vodell is not conducting his campaign by the golden rule." "I know, Jim, but I could not go to Jake Vodell as I've come to you, could I? And I could not talk to the poor foolish strikers who are so terribly deceived by him. Don't you suppose, Jim, that most of the strikers think they are right?" The man stirred uneasily. "I can't help what they think. I can consider only the facts as they are." "That is just what I want, Jim," she cried. "Only it seems to me you're leaving out some of the most important facts. I can't help believing that if our great captains of industry and kings of finance and teachers of economics and labor leaders would consider all the facts, they could find some way to settle these differences between employers and employees and save the industries of the country without starving little girls and boys and their mothers." "If I could have my way, the government would settle the difficulties in a hurry," he said grimly. "You mean the soldiers?" "Yes, the government should put enough troops from the regular army in here to drive these men back to their jobs." "But aren't these working people just as much a part of our government as you employers? Forgive me, Jim, but your plan sounds to me too much like the very imperialism that our soldiers fought against in France." "Imperialism or not," he retorted, "the businessmen of this country will never submit to the dictatorship of Jake Vodell and his kind. It would be chaos and utter ruin. Look what they're doing in other countries." "Of course it would," she agreed. "But the interpreter says that if the businessmen and employers and the better class of employees like Peter Martin would get together as John and Charlie Martin are, that Jake Vodell and his kind would be powerless." He did not answer, and she continued, "As I understand, brother and the interpreter, this man Vodell does not represent the unions at all. He merely uses some of the unions whenever he can through such men as Sam Whaley. Isn't that so, Jim?" "Whether it is or not, the result is the same," he answered. "If the unions of the laboring classes permit themselves to be used as tools by men like Jake Vodell, they must take the consequences." He rose to his feet as one who would end an unprofitable discussion. "Come, Helen. It is useless for you to make yourself ill over these questions. You are worn out now. Come, you really must let me take you home." "I suppose I must," she answered wearily. He went to her. "It is wonderful for you to do what you've done tonight, and for you to come to me like this. Helen, won't you give me my answer? Won't you?" She put out her hands with a little gesture of protest. "Please, Jim, let's not talk about ourselves tonight. I can't." Silently he turned away to take up his hat and coat. Silently she stood waiting. But when he was ready, she said, "Jim, there's just one thing more." "What is it, Helen?" "Tell me truly, you could stop this strike, couldn't you? I mean, if you would come to some agreement with your factory men, all the others would go back to work too, wouldn't they?" "Yes," he said, "I could." She hesitated, then falteringly, "Jim, if I promise to be your wife, will you stop the strike? For the sake of the mothers and children who are cold and hungry and sick, Jim, will you stop the strike?" For a long minute Jim McIver could not answer. He wanted this woman as a man of his strength wants the woman he has chosen. At the beginning of their acquaintance, his interest in Helen had been largely stimulated by the business possibilities of a combination of his factory and Adam Ward's mill. But as their friendship had grown, he had come to love her sincerely, and the more material consideration of their union had faded into the background. Men like McIver, who are capable of playing their games of business with such intensity and passion, are capable of great and enduring love. They are capable, too, of great sacrifices to principle. As he considered her words and grasped the full meaning of her question, his face went white and his nerves were tense with the emotional strain. At last he said gently, "Helen, dear, I love you. I want you to be my wife. I want you more than I've ever wanted anything. Nothing in the world is of any value to me compared with your love. But, dear girl, don't you see that I can't take you like this? You cannot sell yourself to me, even for such a price. I cannot buy you." He turned away. "Forgive me, Jim," she cried. "I did not realize what I was saying. I was thinking of little Maggie. I know you would not be doing what you're doing if you did not think you were right. Take me home now, please, Jim." Silently they went out to his automobile. Tenderly he helped her into the car and tucked the robe about her. The guards swung open the big gates, and they swept away into the night. Past the big mill and the flats, through the silent business district and up the hill they glided swiftly, steadily, and no word passed between them. They were nearing the gate to the Ward estate when Helen suddenly grasped her companion's arm with a low exclamation. At the same moment, McIver instinctively checked the speed of his car. They had both seen the shadowy form of a man walking slowly past the entrance to Helen's home. To Helen there was something strangely familiar in the dim outlines of the moving figure. As they drove slowly on, passing the man who was now in the deeper shadows of the trees and bushes, which at this spot grew close to the fence, she turned her head, keeping her eyes upon him. Suddenly a flash of light stabbed the darkness, a shot rang out, and another. Helen saw the man she was watching fall. With a cry she started from her seat, and before McIver, who involuntarily stopped the car, could check her, she had leaped from her place beside him and was running toward the fallen man. With a shout, "Helen!" McIver followed. As she knelt beside the form on the ground, McIver put his hand on her shoulder. "Helen," he said sharply, as if to bring her to her senses, "you must not. Here, let me." Without moving from her position, she turned her face up to him. "Don't you understand, Jim? It's Captain Charlie." Two watchmen on the Ward estates, who had heard the shots, came running up. McIver tried to insist that Helen go with him to his roadster to the house for help and a larger car, but she refused. When he returned with John, the chauffeur, and one of the big Ward machines, after telephoning the police and the doctor, Helen was kneeling over the wounded man just as he had left her. She did not raise her head when they stood beside her and seemed unconscious of their presence. But when John lifted her up and she heard her brother's voice, she cried out and clung to him like a frightened child. The doctor arrived just as they were carrying Captain Charlie into the room to which Mrs. Ward herself led them. The police came a moment later. While the physician, with John's assistance, was caring for his patient, McIver gave the officers what information he could and went with them to the scene of the shooting. He returned to the house after the officers had completed their examination of the spot in the immediate vicinity, just in time to meet John, who was coming out. Helen and her mother were with the doctor at the bedside of the assassin's victim. McIver wondered at the anguish in John Ward's face, but Captain Charlie's comrade only asked steadily, "Did the police find anything, Jim?" "Not a thing," McIver answered. "What does the doctor say, John?" John turned as if to hide his emotion and for a moment did not answer. Then he spoke those words so familiar to the men of Flanders Fields. "Charlie is going west, Jim. I must bring his father and sister. Would you mind waiting here until I return? Something might develop, you know." "Certainly I will stay, John. Anything that I can do, command me, won't you?" "Thank you, Jim. I'll not be long." While he waited there alone, Jim McIver's mind went back over the strange incidents of the evening, Helen's visit to the Whaley home and her coming to him. Swiftly he reviewed their conversation. What was it that so awakened Helen's deep concern for the laboring class? He had before noticed her unusual interest in the strike and in the general industrial situation, but tonight he had never dreamed that she would go so far. Why had she continued to refuse an answer to his pleading? What was Charlie Martin doing in that neighborhood at that hour? How had Helen recognized him so quickly and surely in the darkness? The man, as these and many other unanswerable questions crowded upon him, he felt a strange foreboding. Mighty forces beyond his understanding seemed stirring about him. As one feels the gathering of a storm in the night, he felt the mysterious movements of elements beyond his control. He was disturbed suddenly by the opening of an outer door behind him. Turning quickly, he faced Adam Ward. Before McIver could speak, the mill owner motioned him to be silent. Wondering, McIver obeyed and watched with amazement as the master of that house closed the door with cautious care and stole softly toward him. To his family, Adam Ward's manner would not have appeared so strange, but McIver had never seen the man under one of his attacks of nervous excitement. "I'm glad you're here, Jim," Adam said in a shaking whisper. "You understand these things. John is a fool. He don't believe when I tell him they're after us. But you know what to do. You have the right idea about handling these unions. Kill the leaders, and if the men won't work, turn the soldiers loose on them. You said the right thing. Drive them to their jobs with bayonets. Pete Martin's boy was one of them, and he got what was coming to him tonight. And John and Helen brought him right here into my house. They've got him upstairs there now. They think I'll stand for it, but you'll see. I'll show them. What was he hanging around my place for in the night like this? I know what he was after, but he got what he wasn't looking for this time. And Pete will get his too if he—" "Father!" Unnoticed, Helen had come into the room behind them. In pacing the open door, she had seen her father and had realized instantly his condition, but the little she had heard him say was not at all unusual to her, and she attached no special importance to his words. Adam Ward was like a child, abashed in her presence. She looked at McIver appealingly. "Father's excited and nervous, Jim. He's not at all well, you know." McIver spoke with gentle authority. "If you will permit me, I will go to his room for a little quiet talk, and then perhaps he can sleep. What do you say, Mr. Ward?" "Yes, yes," agreed Adam hurriedly. Helen looked her gratitude, and McIver led the mill owner away. When they were in Adam's own apartment and the door was shut, McIver's manner changed with startling abruptness. With all the masterful power of his strong-willed nature, he faced his trembling host, and his heavy voice was charged with the force of his dominating personality. "Listen to me, Adam Ward. You must stop this crazy nonsense. If you act and talk like this, the police will have the handcuffs on you before you know where you are." Adam cringed before him. "Jim, do you think that I—" "Shut up," growled McIver. "I don't want to hear another word. I've heard too much now. Charlie Martin stays right here in this house, and your family will give him every attention. His father and sister will be here too, and you'll not open your mouth against them. Do you understand?" "Yes, yes," whispered the now thoroughly frightened Adam. "Don't you dare even to speak to Mrs. Ward or John or Helen as you have to me. And for God's sake, pull yourself together and remember, you don't know any more than the rest of us about this business. You were in your room when you heard the shots." "Yes, of course, Jim, but I—" "Shut up! You're not to talk, I tell you, even to me." Adam Ward whimpered like a child. For another moment McIver glared at him. "Then don't forget that I saw this affair and that I went over the ground with the police. I'm going back downstairs now. You go to bed where you belong and stay there." He turned abruptly and left the room. But as he went down the stairway, McIver drew his handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the perspiration from his brow. What in God's name, he asked himself, did Adam Ward's excited fears mean? What terrible thing gave birth to his mad words? What awful pattern was this that the unseen forces were weaving? And what part was he, with his love for Helen, destined to fill in it all? That his life was being somehow woven into the design he felt certain. But how and to what end? And again the man in all his strength felt that dread foreboding. When Peter Martin and his daughter arrived with John at the big house on the hill, Mrs. Ward met them at the door. The old workman betrayed no consciousness of the distance the years of Adam Ward's material prosperity had placed between these two families that in the old house days had lived in such intimacy. Mary hesitated. It must have been that to the girl who saw it between herself and the happy fulfillment of her womanhood, the distance seemed even greater than it actually was. But her hesitation was only for an instant. One full look into the gentle face that was so marked by the years of uncomplaining disappointment and patient unhappiness, and Mary knew that in the heart of John Ward's mother the separation had brought no change. In the arms of her own mother's dearest friend, the young woman found, even as a child, the love she needed to sustain her in that hour. When they entered the room where Captain Charlie lay unconscious, Helen rose from her watch beside the bed and held out her hands to her girlhood playmate. And in her gesture there was a full surrender, a plea for pardon. Humbly she offered, lovingly she invited, while she held her place beside the man who was slowly passing into that shadow where all class forms are lost, as if she claimed the right before a court higher than the petty courts of human customs. No word was spoken, no word was needed. The daughter of Peter Martin and the daughter of Adam Ward knew that the bond of their sisterhood was sealed. In that wretched home in the flats, little Maggie Whaley smiled in her sleep as she dreamed of her princess lady. The armed guards at their stations around McIver's dark and silent factory kept their watch. The mill, Under the cloud of smoke sang the deep-voiced song of its industry as the night shift carried on. In the room back of the pool hall, Jake Vodell whispered with two of his disciples. In the window of the interpreter's hut on the cliff, a lamp gleamed starlight above the darkness below. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. At the call of the whistle. Everywhere in Millsburg, the shooting of Captain Charlie was the one topic of conversation. As the patrons of the cigar stand came and went, they talked with the philosopher of nothing else. The dry goods pessimist delivered his dark predictions to a group of his fellow citizens and listened with grave shakes of his head to the counter-opinions of the real estate agent. The grocer questioned the garage man, and the lawyer discussed the known details of the tragedy with the postmaster, the hotel keeper, and the politician. The barber asked the banker for his views and reviewed the financier's opinion to the judge, while a farmer and a preacher listened. The milliner told her customers about it, and the stenographer discussed it with the bookkeeper. In the homes, on the streets, and later in the day throughout the country, the shock of the crime was felt. Meanwhile, the efforts of the police to find the assassin were fruitless. The most careful search revealed nothing in the nature of a clue. Millsburg had been very proud of Captain Martin and the honors he had won in France, as Millsburg was proud of Adam Ward and his success, only with a different pride. The people had known Charlie from his birth, as they had known his father and mother all their years. There had been nothing in the young workman's life, as everyone remarked, to lead to such an end. It is doubtful if in the entire community there was a single soul that did not secretly or openly think of the tragedy as being in some dark way an outcome of the strike. And gradually, as the day passed, the conjectures, opinions, and views crystallized into two opposing theories, each with its natural advocates. One division of the people held that the deed was committed by someone of Jake Vodell's followers, because of the workmen's known opposition to a sympathetic strike of the mill workers' union. Captain Charlie's leadership of the mill men was recognized by all, and it was conceded generally that it was his active influence, guided by the Interpreters' Council, that was keeping John Ward's employees at work. Without the assistance of the mill men, the strike leader could not hope for victory. With Captain Charlie's personal influence no longer a factor, it was thought that the agitator might win the majority of the mill workers and so force the Union into line with the strikers. This opinion was held by many of the businessmen and by the more thoughtful members of the unions who had watched with grave apprehension the increasing bitterness of the agitator's hatred of Captain Charlie because of the workmen's successful opposition to his schemes. The opposing theory, which was skillfully advanced by Jake Vodell himself and fostered by his followers, was that the mysterious assassin was an agent of McIver's and that the deed was committed for the very purpose of charging the strikers with the crime and thus turning public sympathy against them. This view, so plausible to the minds of the strikers, prepared as they were by hardship and suffering, found many champions among the mill men themselves. Not a few of those who had stood with Charlie in his opposition to the agitator and against their union joining the strike now spoke openly with bitter feeling against the employer class. The weeks of agitation, the constant pounding of Vodell's arguments, the steady fire of his oratory, and the continual appeal of their class loyalty made it easy for them to stand with their fellow workmen, now that the issue was being so clearly forced. So the lines of the industrial battle were drawn closer. The opposing forces were massed in more definite formation. The feeling was more intense and bitter. In the gloom and hush of the impending desperate struggle that was forced upon it by the emissary of an alien organization, this little American city waited the coming of the dark messenger to Captain Charlie. It was felt by all alike that the workman's death would precipitate the crisis. And through it all, the question most often asked was this: why was the workman Charlie Martin at the gate to Adam Ward's estate at that hour of the night? To this question no one ventured even the suggestion of a satisfactory answer. All that long day Helen kept her watch beside the wounded man. Others were there in the room with her, but she seemed unconscious of their presence. She made no attempt now to hide her love. There was no pretense. There was no pretense, no evasion. Openly before them all, she silently acknowledged him, her man, and to his claim upon her surrendered herself without reserve. James McIver called, but she did not see him. When they urged her to retire and rest, she answered always with the same words: "I must be here when he awakens. I must." And they, loving her, understood. It was as if the assassin's hand had torn aside the curtain of material circumstances and revealed suddenly the realities of their inner lives. They realized now that this man, who had in their old house days won the first woman love of his girl playmate, had held that love against all the outward changes that had taken her from him. John and his mother knew now why Helen had never said yes to Jim McIver. Peter Martin and Mary knew why, in Captain Charlie's heart, there had seemed to be no place for any woman save his sister. At intervals the man in the bed moved uneasily, muttering low words and disconnected fragments of speech. Army words, some of them were, as if his spirit lived for the moment again in the fields of France. At other times the half-formed phrases were of his work, the strike, his home. Again he spoke his sister's name or murmured Father or John. But not once did Helen catch the word she longed to hear him speak. It was as if, even in his unconscious mental wanderings, the man still guarded the name that in secret he had held most dear. 3 times during the day he opened his eyes and looked about, wondering at first, then as though he understood. As one contented and at peace, he smiled and drifted again into the shadows. But now at times his hand went out toward her with a little movement, as though he were feeling for her in the dark. About midnight he seemed to be sleeping so naturally that they persuaded Helen to rest. At daybreak she was again at her post. Mrs. Ward and Mary had gone in their turn for an hour or 2 of sorely needed rest. Peter Martin was within call downstairs. John, who was watching with his sister, had left the room for a moment, and Helen was at the bedside alone. Suddenly, through the quiet morning air came the deep-toned call of the mill whistle. As a soldier awakens at the sound of the morning bugle, Captain Charlie opened his eyes. Instantly she was bending over him. As he looked up into her face, she called his name softly. She saw the light of recognition come into his eyes. She saw the glory of his love. "Helen," he said, and again, "Helen." It was as if the death that claimed him had come also for her. For the first time in many months, the voice of the mill was not heard by the interpreter in his little hut on the cliff. Above the silent buildings, the smoke cloud hung like a pall. From his wheelchair, the old basket-maker watched the long procession moving slowly down the hill. There were no uniforms in that procession. No military band with muffled drums led that solemn march. No regimental colors in honor of the dead. There were no trappings of war, no martial ceremony. And yet, to the interpreter, Captain Charlie died in the service of his country as truly as if he had been killed on the field of battle. Long after the funeral procession had passed beyond his sight, the interpreter sat there at the window, motionless, absorbed in thought. Twice Silent Billy came to stand beside his chair, but he did not heed. His head was bowed, his great shoulders stooped, his hands were idle. There was a sound of someone knocking at the door. The interpreter did not hear. The sound was repeated, and this time he raised his head questioningly. Again it came, and the old basket-maker called, "Come in." The door opened. Jim McIver entered. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Jake Vodell's mistake. Since that night of the tragedy, McIver had struggled to grasp the hidden meaning of the strange series of incidents. But the more he tried to understand, the more he was confused and troubled. Nor had he been able, strong-willed as he was, to shake off the feeling that he was in the midst of unseen forces, that about him mysterious influences were moving steadily to some fixed and certain end. In constant touch through his agents with the strike situation, he had watched the swiftly forming sentiment of the public. He knew that the turning point of the industrial war was near. He did not deceive himself. He knew Jake Vodell's power. He knew the temper of the strikers. He saw clearly that if the assassin who killed Captain Charlie was not speedily discovered, the community would suffer under a reign of terror such as the people had never conceived. And, what was of more vital importance to McIver, perhaps, if the truth were not soon revealed, Jake Vodell's charges that the murder was inspired by McIver himself would become, in the minds of many, an established fact. With the full realization of all that would result to the community and to himself if the identity of the murderer was not soon established, McIver was certain in his own mind that he alone knew the guilty man. To reveal what he believed to be the truth of the tragedy would be to save the community and himself, and to lose for all time the woman he loved. McIver did not know that through the tragedy Helen was already lost to him. In his extremity, the factory owner had come at last to the man who was said to wield such a powerful influence over the minds of the people. He had never before seen the interior of that hut on the cliff, nor met the man who for so many years had been confined there. Standing just outside the door, he looked curiously about the room with the unconscious insolence of his strength. The man in the wheelchair did not speak. When Billy looked at him, he signaled his wishes in their silent language and, watching his visitor, waited. For a long moment McIver gazed at the old basket-maker as if estimating his peculiar strength. Then he said with an unintentional touch of contempt in his heavy voice, "So you are the interpreter." "And you," returned the man in the wheelchair gently, "are McIver." McIver was startled. "How did you know my name?" "Is McIver's name a secret also?" came the strange reply. McIver's eyes flashed with a light that those who sat opposite him in the game of business had often seen. With perfect self-control, he said coolly, "I've been told often that I should come to see you, but—" He paused and again looked curiously about the room. The interpreter, smiling, caught up in the unfinished sentence. "But you do not see how an old, poverty-stricken and crippled maker of baskets can be of any use to you." McIver spoke as one measuring his words. "They tell me you help people who are in trouble." "And are you then in trouble?" asked the interpreter kindly. The other did not answer, and the man in the wheelchair continued still kindly, "What trouble can the great and powerful McIver have? You've never been hungry. You've never felt the cold. You have no children to starve, no son to be killed. I suppose you hold me personally responsible for the strike and for all the hardships that the strikers have brought upon themselves and their families," said McIver. "You fellows who teach this brotherhood of man rot and never have more than one meal ahead of yourselves always blame men like me for all the suffering in the world." The interpreter replied with a dignity that impressed even McIver, "Who am I that I should assume to blame anyone? Who are you, sir, that assume the power implied by either your acceptance or your denial of the responsibility? You're only a part of the whole, as I am a part. You in your life place are no less a creature of circumstances, an accident, than I here in my wheelchair, than Jake Vodell. We are all, you and I, Jake Vodell, Adam Ward, Peter Martin, Sam Whaley, we're all but parts of the great oneness of life. The want, the misery, the suffering, the unhappiness of humanity is of that unity no less than is the prosperity, peace, and happiness of the people. Before we can hope to bring order out of this industrial chaos, we must recognize our mutual dependence upon the whole and acknowledge the equality of our guilt in the wretched conditions that now exist." As the interpreter spoke, James McIver again felt the movement of those unseen forces that were about him. His presence in that little hut on the cliff seemed now a part of some plan that was not of his making. He was awed by the sudden conviction that he had not come to the interpreter of his own volition, but had been led there by something beyond his understanding. "Why should your fellow workmen not hate you, sir?" continued the old basket-maker. "You hold yourself apart, superior, of a class distinct and separate. Your creed of class is intolerance. Your very business policy is a declaration of class war. Your boast that you can live without the working man is madness. You can no more live without them than they can live without you. You can no more deny the mutual dependence of employer and employee with safety to yourself than Samson of old could pull down the pillars of the temple without being himself buried in the ruins." By an effort of will, McIver strove to throw off the feeling that possessed him. He spoke as one determined to assert himself. We cannot recognize the rights of Jake Vodell and his lawless followers to dictate to us in our business. It would mean ruin, not only of our industries, but of our government. Exactly so, agreed the interpreter. And yet, sir, you claim for yourself the right to live by the same spirit of imperialism that animates Vodell. You make the identical class distinction that he makes. You appeal to the same class intolerance and hatred. You and Jake Vodell have together brought about this industrial war in Millsburg. The community itself, labor unions and businessmen alike, is responsible for tolerating the imperialism that you and this alien agitator, in opposition to each other, advocate. The community is paying the price. The factory owner flushed. Of course you would say these things to Jake Vodell. I do, returned the interpreter gently. Oh, you are in touch with him then? He comes here sometimes. He's coming this afternoon at 4:00. Will you not stay and meet him, Mr. McIver? McIver hesitated. He decided to ignore the invitation. With more respect in his manner than he had so far shown, he said courteously, May I ask why Jake Vodell comes to you? The interpreter replied sadly, as one who accepts the fact of his failure, For the same reason that McIver came. McIver started with surprise. You know why I came to you? The man in the wheelchair looked steadily into his visitor's eyes. I know that you're not personally responsible for the death of the workman, Captain Martin. McIver sprang to his feet. He fairly gasped as the flood of questions raised by the interpreter's words swept over him. You know who killed Charlie Martin? He demanded at last. The old basket-maker did not answer. If you know, cried McIver, why in God's name do you not tell the people? Surely, sir, you're not ignorant of the danger that threatens this community. The death of this Union man has given Vodell just the opportunity he needed, and he is using it. If you dare to shield the guilty man, whoever he is, you will— Peace, McIver. This community will not be plunged into the horrors of a class war such as you rightly fear. There are yet enough sane and loyal American citizens in Millsburg to extinguish the fire that you and Jake Vodell have started. When Jake Vodell came to the interpreter's hut shortly after McIver had left, he was clearly in a state of nervous excitement. Well, he said shortly, I'm here. What do you want? Why did you send for me? The interpreter spoke deliberately with his eyes fixed upon the dark face of the agitator. Vodell, I have told you twice that your campaign in Millsburg was a failure. Your coming to this community was a mistake. Your refusal to recognize the power of the thing that made your defeat certain was a mistake. You have now made your third and final mistake. A mistake? Ha! That's what you think. You do not know. I tell you, I've turned a trick that will win for me the game. Already the people are rallying to me. I've put McIver at last in a hole from which he will not escape. The mill workers are ready now to do anything I say. You will see, tomorrow, I will have these employers and all their capitalist class eating out of my hand. To me they shall beg for mercy. I will dictate the terms to them, and they will pay. You may take my word, they will pay. The man paced to and fro with the triumphant air of a conqueror, and his voice rang with his exultation. No, Jake Vodell, said the interpreter calmly. You are deceiving yourself. Your dreams are as vain as your mistake is fatal." The man faced the old basket-maker suddenly, as if arrested by a possible meaning in the interpreter's words that had not at first caught his attention. "And what is this mistake that I've made?" he growled. The answer came with solemn portent. "You have killed the wrong man." The agitator was stunned. His mouth opened as if he would speak, but no word came from his trembling lips. He drew back as if to escape. The old man in the wheelchair continued sadly, "I am the one you should have killed. I am the cause of your failure to gain the support of the Mill Workers' Union." The strike leader recovered himself with a shrug of his heavy shoulders. "So that's it," he sneered. "You would accuse me of shooting your Captain Charlie, eh?" "You have accused yourself, sir." "But how?" "By the use you're making of Captain Charlie's death. If you did not know who committed the crime, if you did not feel sure that the identity of the assassin would remain a mystery to the people, you would not dare risk charging the employers with it." With an oath the other returned, "I tell you that McIver or his hired gunmen did it so they could lay the blame on the strikers and so turn the Mill Workers' Union against us. That is what the mill men believe. That is what you want them to believe. It is an old trick, Vodell. You've used it before." The agitator's eyes narrowed under his scowling brows. "Look here," he growled. "I do not like this talk of yours. Perhaps you had better prove what you charge, eh?" "Please God, I will prove it," came the calm answer. Jake Vodell, as he looked down upon the seemingly helpless old man in the wheelchair, was thinking, "It would be safer if this old basket-maker were not permitted to speak these things to others. His influence, after all, is a thing to consider." "No, Jake Vodell," said the interpreter gently. "You won't do it. Billy Rand is watching us. If you make a move to do what you're thinking, Billy will kill you." The interpreter raised his hand, and his silent companion came quickly to stand beside his chair. With a shrug of his shoulders, Vodell drew back a few steps toward the door. "Bah, why should I waste my time with a crippled old basket-maker? I've work to do. If you watch from the window of your shanty, you will see tomorrow whether or not the mill workers are with me. I will make for you a demonstration that will be known through the country. I told you at the first that the working people will find out who is their friend. Now you shall see what they will do to the enemies of their class. Who can say, Mr. Interpreter, perhaps your miserable hut so high up here would make a good torch to signal the beginning of the show, eh?" When the door had closed behind Jake Vodell, the interpreter said aloud, "So he has set tomorrow night for his demonstration. We must work fast, Billy. There's no time to lose." With his hands he asked his companion for paper and pencil. When Billy brought them, he wrote a few words and, folding the message, gave it to the big man who stood waiting. For a few minutes they talked together in their silent way. Then Billy Rand put the interpreter's message carefully in his pocket and hurriedly left the hut. That evening Jake Vodell addressed the largest crowd that had yet assembled at his street meetings. With characteristic eloquence, the agitator pictured Captain Charlie as a martyr to the unprincipled schemes of the employer class. "McIver and his crew are charging the strikers with this crime in order to set our union brothers against us," he shouted. "They think that by setting up a division among us, they can win. They know that if the working people stand together, true to their class, loyal to their comrades, they will rule the world. Why don't the police produce the murderer of Captain Charlie? I will tell you the answer, my brother workman. It is because the law and the officers of the law are under the control of those who do not want the murderer produced. That is why. They dare not produce him. The life of a poor working man, what is that to these masters of crime who acknowledge no law but the laws they make for themselves? You workers have no laws. A slave knows no justice but the whim of his master. Think of the mothers and children in your homes, you slaves who create the wealth of your lords and masters. And now they've taken the life of one of your truest and most loyal Union leaders. Where will they stop? If you do not stand like men against these cruel outrages, what have you to hope for? You know as well as I that no workman in Millsburg would raise his hand against such a fellow worker as Captain Charlie Martin. While the agitator was speaking, Billy Rand moved quickly here and there through the crowd, as if searching for someone. After the mass meeting on the street, there was a meeting of the Mill Workers' Union. Later, Vodell's inner circle met in the room back of Dago Bill's pool hall. It was midnight when Billy Rand finally returned to the waiting interpreter. Evidently, he had failed in the mission entrusted to him by the old basket-maker. The next morning, Billy Rand again went forth with the interpreter's message. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The Mob and the Mill. On the morning following the day of the funeral, scarcely half of the usual force of workmen appeared at the mill. The men who did choose to work were forced to pass a picket line of strikers who, with jeers and threats and arguments, sought to turn them from their purpose. The death of Captain Charlie, by defining more clearly the two lines of public sentiment, had increased Jake Vodell's strength materially, but the Mill Workers' Union had not yet officially declared for the sympathetic strike that would deliver the community wholly into the hands of the agitator. The mill men, who were still opposed to Jake Vodell's leadership, and coolly refused to hold the employers guilty of the death of Captain Charlie upon the mere unsupported assertions of the strike leader, were therefore free to continue their work. The action of the members of the Mill Workers' Union who were loyal to John, however, quite naturally increased the feeling of their comrades who had accepted Vodell's version of the murderer. Thus the final crisis of the industrial battle centered about the mill. Every hour that John Ward could keep the mill running lessened Vodell's chances of final victory. The strike leader knew that if these days immediately following Captain Charlie's death passed without closing the mill, his cause was lost. The workmen were now aroused to the highest pitch of excitement. The agitator realized that if they were not committed by some action to his cause before the fever of their madness began to abate, his followers would, day by day, in ever-increasing numbers, go back to work under John. The successful operation of the mill was the demonstration to the public that Vodell's campaign against the employers was not endorsed by the better and stronger element of employees. To the mind of the strike leader, a counter-demonstration was imperative. To that immediate end, the man now bent every effort. All day the members of the agitator's inner circle were active. When evening came, a small company of men gathered in a vacant store building not far from the mill. There was little talk among them. When one did speak, it was to utter a mere commonplace, or perhaps to greet some newcomer. They were as men who meet at a given place by agreement to carry out some definite and carefully laid plan. Moment by moment, the company grew in numbers until the gathering assumed such proportions that it overflowed the building and filled the street. And now, scattered through the steadily growing crowd, the members of that inner circle were busy with exhortations and arguments, preparing the workmen for what was to follow. Presently, from the direction of the strike headquarters, came another company with Jake Vodell himself in their midst. These had assembled at the strike headquarters. Without pausing, they swept down the street toward the mill, taking with them the crowd that was waiting at the old store. Scarcely had they reached the front of the large main building when they were joined by still another crowd that had been gathering in the neighborhood of McIver's factory. Thus, with startling suddenness, a great company of workmen was assembled at the mill. But a large part of that company had yet to be molded to Vodell's purpose. Many had gone to the designated places in response to the simple announcement that a labor meeting would be held there. Only those of the agitator's trusted inner circle had known of the plan to unite these smaller gatherings in one great mass meeting. Only these chosen few knew the real purpose of that meeting. There were hundreds of workmen in that throng who were opposed to Vodell and his methods, but they were unorganized with no knowledge of the strike leader's plans. And so it had been easy for the members of that inner circle to lead these separate smaller gatherings to the larger assembly in front of the mill. To accomplish the full purpose of the demonstration against the employer class, the strike leader must make it appear to the public as the unified action of the working people of Millsburg. The requirements of his profession made Jake Vodell a master of mob psychology. With the leaven of his chosen inner circle and the temper of the many strikers whose nerves were already strained to the breaking point by their weeks of privation, the agitator was confident that he could bend the assembled multitude to his will. Those who were opposed to his leadership and to his methods, disorganized and taken by surprise as they were, would be helpless. At the same time, their presence in the mob would appear to give their sanction and support to whatever was accomplished. Quickly, word of the gathering spread throughout the community. From every direction, from the flats, from the neighborhood of the Martin home, and from the more distant parts of the city, men were moving toward the mill. With every moment the crowd increased in size. Everywhere among the mass of men, Vodell's helpers were busy. A block away, an automobile stopped at the curb in front of a deserted house. A man left the car and, keeping well out of the light from the street lamps, walked swiftly to the outskirts of the mob. With his face hidden by the turned-up collar of his overcoat and the brim of his hat pulled low, he moved here and there in the thin edge of the multitude. The agitator, standing on a goods box on the street opposite the big doors of the main mill building, began his address. As one man, the hundreds of assembled workmen turned toward the leader of the strike. A hush fell over them. But there was one in that great crowd to whom the words of Jake Vodell meant nothing. Silent Billy Rand, pushing his way through the press of men, searched face after face with simple, untiring purpose. The squad of police arrived. Vodell, calling attention to them, facetiously invited the guardians of the law to a seat of honor on the rostrum. The crowd laughed. At that moment Billy Rand caught sight of the face he was seeking. When the interpreter's messenger grasped his arm, the man, who was standing well back in the edge of the crowd, started with fear. Billy thrust the note into his hand. As he read the message, he shook so that the paper rattled in his fingers. Helplessly he looked about. He seemed paralyzed with horror. Again Billy Rand grasped his arm, and this time drew him aside, out of the crowd. Helpless and shaken, the man made no effort to resist, as the interpreter's deaf and dumb companion hurried him away down the street. At the foot of the zigzag stairway, Billy's charge sank down on the lower step, as if he had no strength to go on. Without a moment's pause, Billy lifted him to his feet and almost carried him up the stairs and into the hut to place him cowering and whimpering before the man in the wheelchair. John and Helen had gone to the Martin cottage that evening to spend an hour with the old workman and his daughter. They had just arrived when the telephone rang. It was the watchman at the mill. He had called John at the Ward home, and Mrs. Ward had directed him to call the cottage. In a few words, John told the others of the crowd at the mill. He must go at once. "But not alone, boy," said Peter Martin. "This is no more your job than 'tis mine." As they were leaving, John said hurriedly to Helen, "Telephone Tom to come for you at once and take Mary home with you. Mother may need you, and Mary must not be left here alone. I'll bring Uncle Pete home with me." A moment later the old workman and the general manager, in John's roadster, were on their way to the mill. When Tom arrived at the cottage with Helen's car, the two young women were ready. They were entering the automobile when Billy Rand appeared. It was evident from his labored breathing that he had been running, but his face betrayed no excitement. With a pleased smile, as one who would say, "Luckily I got here just in time," he handed a folded paper to Mary. By the light of the automobile lamp, she read the interpreter's message aloud to Helen. "Telephone John to come to me at once with a big car. If you can't get John, tell Helen." In an instant they looked at each other questioningly. Then Helen spoke to the chauffeur. "To the interpreters, John." She indicated to Billy Rand that he was to go with them. It was not Jake Vodell's purpose to call openly in his address to the assembled workmen for an attack on the mill. Such a demonstration against the employer class was indeed the purpose of the gathering, but it must come as the spontaneous outburst from the men themselves. His speech was planned merely to lay the kindling for the fire. The actual lighting of the blaze would follow later. The conflagration, too, would be started simultaneously from so many different points in the crowd that no one individual could be singled out as having incited the riot. The agitator was still speaking when John and Peter Martin arrived on the scene. Quietly and carefully, John drove through the outskirts of the crowd to a point close to the wall and not far from the main door of the building, nearly opposite the speaker. Stopping the motor, the two men sat in the car listening to Vodell's address. The agitator did not call attention to the presence of the manager of the mill as he had to the police, nor was there any noticeable break in his speech. But throughout the great throng there was a movement, a ripple of excitement, as the men looked toward John and the old workman, and turned each to his neighbor with low-spoken comments. And then, from every part of the crowd, the agitator saw individuals moving quietly toward the manager's car until between the two men in the automobile In the main body of the speaker's audience, a small, compact group of workmen stood shoulder to shoulder. They were the men of the Mill Workers' Union, who had refused to follow Jake Vodell. And every man, as he took his place, greeted John and the old workman with a low word or a nod and a smile. The agitator concluded his address and, amid the shouts and applause, left his place on the goods box to move about among his followers. Presently a low murmur arose like a growling undertone. Now and then a voice was raised sharply in characteristic threat or epithet against the employer class. The murmur swelled into a heavy, menacing roar. The crowd, shaken by some invisible inner force, swayed to and fro. A shrill yell rang out, and at the signal scores of hoarse voices were raised in shouts of mad defiance, threats, and calls for action. As the whirling waters of a maelstrom are drawn to the central point, the mob was massed before the doors of the mill. The little squad of police was struggling forward. John Ward sprang to his feet. The loyal Union men about the car stood fast. At the sound of the manager's voice, the mob hesitated. In all that maddened crowd, there was not a soul in ignorance of John Ward's comradeship with his fellow workmen. In spite of Jake Vodell's careful teaching, in spite of his devilish skill in using McIver as an example in his appeals and arguments inciting their hatred against all employers as a class, they were checked in their madness by the presence of Captain Charlie's friend. But it was only for a moment. The members of Vodell's inner circle were at work among them. John had spoken but a few sentences when he was interrupted by voices from the crowd. "Tell us where your old man got this mill that he says is his." "Where did Adam get his castle on the hill?" "We and our families live in shanties." "Who paid for your automobile, John?" "We and our children walk." As the manager, ignoring the voices, continued his appeal, the interruptions came with more frequency, accompanied now by groans, shouts, hisses, and derisive laughter. "You're all right, John, but you're in with the wrong bunch. We're going to run things for a while now and give you a chance to do some real work." The police pleaded with them. The mob jeered. "Go get a job with McIver's gunmen. Go find the man who murdered Captain Charlie." Once more the growling undertones swelled into a roar. Come on, we've had enough talk. Let's do something." As the crowd surged again toward the mill doors, there was a forward movement of the close-packed group of workmen about the car. John, leaning over them, said sharply, No, not that. Men, not that." Then suddenly the movement of the mob toward the mill was again checked as Peter Martin raised his voice. "If you won't listen to Mr. Ward," said the old man when he had caught their attention, "perhaps you'll not mind hearing me." In the stillness of the uncertain moment, a voice answered, "Go ahead, Uncle Pete." Standing on the seat of the automobile, the kindly old workman looked down into the grim faces of his comrades, and as they saw him there and thought of Captain Charlie, a deep breath of feeling swept over the throng. In his slow, thoughtful way, the veteran of the mill spoke. "There'll be no one among you, I'm thinking, that'll dare say as how I don't belong to the working class. And there'll be no man that'll deny my right to be heard in any meeting of Millsburg workingmen. I helped the interpreter organize the first union that was ever started in this city, and so far we've managed to carry on our union work without any help from outsiders who have no real right to call themselves American citizens even, much less to dictate to us American workmen." There was a stir among Vodell's followers. A voice rose, but was silenced by the muttered protest which it caused. Jake Vodell, quick to grasp the feeling of the crowd, was making his way toward his goods box rostrum. Here and there he paused a moment to whisper to one of his inner circle. The old workman continued, "You all know the principles that my boy Charlie stood for. You know that he was just as much against employers like McIver as he was against men like this agitator who's leading you into this trouble here tonight. Jake Vodell has made you believe that my boy was killed by the employer class. But I tell you men that Charlie had no better friend in the world than his employer, John Ward. And I tell you that John and Charlie were working together here for the best interests of us all, just as they were together in France. You know what my boy would say if he was here tonight. He would say just what I'm saying. He would tell you that we workmen have got to stand by the employers who stand by us. He would tell you that we American union workmen must protect ourselves and our country against this anarchy and lawlessness that has got you men here tonight so all excited and beside yourselves that you don't know what you're doing. In Captain Charlie's name, I ask you men to break up this mob and go quietly to your homes where you can think this thing over. From his position across the street, Jake Vodell suddenly interrupted the old workman with a rapid fire of questions and insinuations and appeals to the mob. Peter Martin, poorly equipped for a duel of words with such a master of the art, was silenced. Slowly the mob swung again to the agitator. Under the spell of his influence, they were responding once more to his call, when a big automobile rolled swiftly up to the edge of the crowd and stopped. John Ward was the first to recognize his sister's car. With a word to the men near him, he sprang to the ground and ran forward. The loyal workman went with him. In the surprise of the moment, not knowing what was about to happen, Jake Vodell stood silent. In breathless suspense, every eye in the crowd was fixed upon that little group about Helen's car. Another moment, and the assembled workmen witnessed a sight that they will never forget. Down the lane that opened as if by magic through the mass of men came the loyal members of the Mill Workers' Union. High on their shoulders they carried the interpreter. In a silence deep as the stillness of death, they bore him through those close-packed walls of humanity straight to the big doors of the mill. With their backs against the building, they held him high, face to face with Jake Vodell and the mob that the agitator was swaying to his will. The old basket-maker's head was bare, and against the dark background of the dingy walls, his venerable face with its crown of silvery hair was as the face of a prophet. They did not cheer. In silent awe they stood with tense, upturned faces. A voice, low but clear and distinct, cut the stillness. "Hats off!" As one man, they uncovered their heads. The interpreter's deep voice, kindly but charged with strange authority, swept over them. "Workmen, what are you doing here? Are you toys that you give yourselves as playthings into the hand of this man who chooses to use you in his game? Are you children to be led by his idle words and moved by his foolish dreams? Are you men, or are you cattle to be stampeded by him without reason to your own destruction? Would you, at this stranger's bidding, dig a pit for your fancied enemies and fall into it yourselves? Not a man in that great crowd of workmen moved. In breathless silence they stood awed by the majesty of the old basket-maker's presence, hushed by the sorrowful authority of his voice. Solemnly the interpreter continued. The one who took the life of your comrade workman, Captain Charlie, was not a tool in the hands of your employers, as you've been led to believe. Neither was that dreadful act inspired by the workmen of Millsburg. Captain Charlie was killed by a poor, foolish weakling who was under the same spell that tonight has so nearly led you into this blind folly of destroying that which should be your glory and your pride. Sam Whaley has confessed to me. He has surrendered himself to the proper authorities. But the instigator of the crime, the one who planned, ordered, and directed it, the leader who dominated and drove this poor tool to the deed, is this man, Jake Vodell. The sound of the interpreter's voice ceased. For a moment longer that dead silence held. Then, as the full import of the old basket-maker's words went home to them, the crowd, with a roar of fury, turned toward the spot where the agitator had stood when the arrival of the interpreter interrupted his address. But Jake Vodell had disappeared. End of chapter 28. Book 3, Chapter 29 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. Contracts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. They had carried the interpreter back to his wheelchair in the hut on the cliff. John, Peter Martin, and the two young women were bidding the old basket-maker good night, when suddenly they were silenced by the dull, heavy sound of a distant explosion. A moment they stood gazing at one another. Then John voiced the thoughts that had gripped the minds of everyone in that little group. The mill. Springing to the door that opened onto the balcony porch, John threw it open and went out, taking the interpreter in his chair. In breathless silence they strained their eyes toward the dark mass of the mill, with its forest of stacks and its many lights. "Everything seems to be all right there," murmured John. But as the last word left his lips, a chorus of exclamations came from the others. Farther up the river, a dull red glow flushed the sky. "McIver's!" "The factory," the interpreter said quietly. "Jake Vodell." With every second, the red glow grew brighter, reaching higher and higher, spreading wider and wider over the midnight sky. Then they could see the flames, thread-like streaks and flashes in the dark cloud of smoke, at first, but increasing in volume, climbing and writhing, twisting columns of red fury. The wild, long-drawn shriek of the fire whistles, the clanging roar of the engines, the frantic rush of speeding automobiles awoke the echoes of the cliffs and aroused the sleeping creatures on the hillsides. The volume of the leaping, whirling mass of flames increased until the red glare shut out the stars. The officers of the law who were hunting Jake Vodell heard that explosion and telephoned their stations for orders. The businessmen of the little city, awakened from their sleep, looked from their windows, muttered drowsy conjectures, and returned to their beds. Mothers and children in their homes heard and turned uneasily in their dreams. The dwellers in the flats heard and wondered fearfully. Before morning dawned, the telephone wires would carry the word throughout the land. In every corner of our country the people would read, as they have all too often read, of similar explosions. They would read, offer idle comments perhaps, and straightway forget. That is the wonder and shame of it, that with these frequent warnings ringing in our ears, we are not warned. With these things continually forced upon our attention, we do not heed. With the demonstration before our eyes, we are not convinced. We are not aroused to the meaning of it all. In his cell in the country jail, Sam Whaley heard that explosion and knew what it was. The interpreter was right when he said, "Jake Vodell." It was an hour, perhaps, after the interpreter's friends had left the hut when the old basket-maker, who was still sitting at the window watching the burning factory, heard an automobile approaching at a frightful pace from the direction of the fire. The noise of the speeding machine ceased with startling suddenness at the foot of the stairway, and the interpreter heard someone running up the steps with headlong haste. Without pausing to knock, Adam Ward burst into the room and stood panting and shaking with mad excitement before the man in the wheelchair. The mill owner's condition was pitiful. By his eyes that were glittering with wild, unnatural light, by the gray, twitching features, the grotesque gestures, the trembling, jerking limbs, the interpreter knew that the last flickering gleam of reason had gone out. The hour toward which the man himself had looked with such dread had come. Adam Ward was insane. With a leering grin of triumph, the madman came closer to the old basket-maker. "I got away again. They were right after me, but they couldn't catch me. That roadster of mine is the fastest car in the county. Cost me $4,000. I knew if I could get here, I would be safe. They wouldn't think I'm looking for me here in your shanty, would they? They can't get in anyway if they should come. You wouldn't let them get me, would you?" "Peace, Adam Ward. You are safe here." The insane man chuckled. "The folks at the house think I'm in my room asleep. They don't know that I never sleep. I'll tell you something. If a man sleeps, he goes to hell, hell, hell." His voice rose almost to a scream, and he shook with terror. "Did you see it? Did you see when that hell broke out tonight over there where McIver's factory used to be? I did. I was there, and I heard them roaring in the fibers of torment and screaming in the flames. They called for me, but I laughed and came here. They'll never get Adam Ward into hell. They don't know it yet, but I've got a contract with God. I fixed it up myself just like you told me to, and God signed it without reading it, just as Peter Martin did. I'll show them. It'll take more than God to get the best of Adam Ward in the deal." He walked about the room, waving his arms and laughing in hideous triumph, muttering mad boasts and mumbling to himself, or taunting the phantom creatures of his disordered brain. The helpless interpreter could only wait silently for whatever was to follow. At last the madman turned again to the old basket-maker. Placing a chair close in front of the interpreter, he seated himself and in a confidential whisper said, "Did you know that everybody thinks I'm going insane? Well, I'm not. Nobody knows it, but it's not me that's crazy. It's John. He's been that way ever since he got home from France. The poor boy thinks the world is still at war and that he can run the mill just as he fought the Germans over there. There's another thing you ought to know, too. You are crazy yourself. Don't be afraid, I won't tell anybody else, but you ought to know it. If a man knows it when he's going crazy, it gives him a chance to fix things up with God so they can't get him into hell for all eternity, you see. So I thought I'd better tell you." The interpreter spoke in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. "Thank you, Adam. I appreciate your kindness." "I was there at the mill tonight," Adam continued, "and I heard you tell them who killed Charlie Martin. But then those crazy fools went tearing off to hunt Jake Vodell." He chuckled and laughed. "What difference does it make who killed Charlie Martin? I own the patented process. I'm the man they want. But they can't touch me. I hired the best lawyers in the country, and I've got it sewed up tight. I put one over on Pete Martin in that deal, and I've put one over on God, too. I've got God sewed up tight, I tell you, just like I sewed up Peter Martin. They can howl their heads off, but they'll never get me into hell." He leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of a businessman crediting himself with having closed a successful transaction. Then, with a manner and voice that was apparently normal, he said, "Did I ever tell you about how I got that patented process of mine, Wallace?" The interpreter knew by his use of that name, so seldom heard in these later years, that Adam's mind was back in the old days, when, with Peter Martin, they had worked side by side at the same bench in the mill. Hoping to calm him, the old basket-maker returned indifferently, "No, Adam, I don't remember that you ever told me. But don't you think some other time would be better, perhaps, than tonight? It's getting late, and you—" The other interrupted with a wave of his hand. "Oh, that's all right. It's safe enough to talk about it now. Besides," he added with a cunning leer, "nobody would believe you if you should tell them the truth. You're nothing but a crazy old basket-maker, and I am Adam Ward. Don't forget that for a minute." He glared threateningly at the man in the wheelchair, and the interpreter, fearing another outburst, said soothingly, "Certainly, Adam, I understand. I will not forget." With the manner of one relating an interesting story in which he himself figured with great personal credit, Adam Ward said, "It was Pete Martin, you see, who actually discovered the new process. But luckily for me, I was the first one he told about it. He had worked it all out, and I persuaded him not to say a thing to anyone else until the patents were secured. Pete didn't really know the value of what he had. But I knew. I saw from the first that it would revolutionize the whole business, and I knew it would make a fortune for the man that owned the patents. Pete and I were pretty good friends in those days, but friendship don't go far in business. I never had a friend in my life that I couldn't use some way. So I had Pete over to my house every evening and made a lot over him and talked over his new process and made suggestions how he should handle it, until finally he offered me a half interest if I would look after the business details. That, of course, was exactly what I was playing for. And all this time, you see, I took mighty good care that not a soul was around when Pete and I talked things over. So we fixed it all up between us, with no one to hear it, mind you, that we were to share equally, half and half, in whatever the new process brought. After that, I went ahead and got all the patents good and tight, and then I fixed up a nice little document for Pete to sign. But I waited, and I didn't say a word to Pete until one evening when he and his wife were studying and figuring out the plans for the house they were going to build. I sat and planned with them a while until I saw how Pete's mind was all on his new house. And then all at once I put my little document down on the table in front of him and said, "By the way, Pete, those patents will be coming along pretty soon, and I've had a little contract fixed up just as a matter of form. You know how we planned it all. Here's where you sign." Adam Ward paused to laugh with insane glee. "Pete did just what I knew he'd do. He signed that document without even reading a line of it and went on with his house planning and figuring as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something big had happened. Instead of the way we had planned it together when we were talking alone with nobody to witness it, Pete signed to me outright for $1 all his rights and interests in that new patented process. Again the madman laughed triumphantly. Pete never even found out what he had done until nearly a year later. And then he wouldn't believe it until the lawyers made him. He couldn't do anything, of course. I had it sewed up too tight. That process is mine, I tell you, mine by all the laws of the country. What if I did take advantage of him? That's business. A man ought to have sense enough to read what he puts his signature to. You don't catch me trusting anybody far enough to sign anything he puts before me without reading it. Why, what are you crying for? Adam Ward was not mistaken. The interpreter's eyes were wet with tears. The sight of the old basket-maker's grief sent the insane man off on another tangent. Don't you worry about me. Helen and John and their mother worry a lot about me. They think I'm going to hell. He sprang to his feet with a hoarse, inarticulate cry. They'll never get me into hell. God has got to keep his contracts, and I've fixed it up so he'll have to save me whether he wants to or not. The papers are all signed and everything. My lawyer's got them in his safe. God can't help himself. You told me I'd better do it, and I have. I'm not afraid to meet God now. I'll show him just like I showed Pete. He rushed from the room as abruptly as he had entered. The interpreter heard him plunging down the stairs. The roar of his automobile died away in the distance. In an early morning extra edition, the Millsburg Clarion announced the death of two of the most prominent citizens. James McIver was killed in the explosion that burned his factory. Adam Ward's body was found in a secluded corner of his beautiful estate. He died by his own hand. The cigar store philosopher put his paper down and reached into the showcase for the box that the judge wanted. It looks like McIver played the wrong cards in his little game with Jake Vodell, he remarked as the judge made a careful selection. I'm afraid so, returned the judge. The postmaster took a handful from the same box and said, as he dropped $1 on the top of the showcase, I see Sam Whaley has confessed that the blowing up of the factory was all set as part of their program. Their plan was to wreck the mill first, then McIver's place. Where do you suppose Jake Vodell got away to? Hard to guess, said the judge. The philosopher put the proper change before them. There's one thing sure. The people of these here United States had better get good and busy finding out where he is. It was significant that neither the philosopher nor the customers mentioned the passing of Adam Ward. End of chapter 29. Book 4, Chapter 30 of Helen of the Old House by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Tell them, O guns, that we have heard their call, that we have sworn and will not turn aside, that we will onward till we win or fall, that we will keep the faith for which they died. Chapter 30. Just like the interpreter said. It is doubtful if in all Millsburg there was a soul who felt a personal loss in the passing of their esteemed citizen, Adam Ward. During the years that followed his betrayal of Peter Martin's friendship, the man had never made a friend who loved him for himself, who believed in him or trusted him. In business circles, his reputation for deals that were always carefully legal but often obviously dishonest had caused the men he met to accept him only so far as their affairs made the contact necessary. Because of the power he had through his possession of the patented process, he was known. His place in the community had been fixed by what he took from the community. His habit of boasting of his possessions, of his power, and of his business triumphs, and his way of considering the people as his personal debtors had been a never-failing subject of laughing comment. Men spoke of his death in a jocular vein, made jests about it, wondering what he was really worth. But one and all invariably concluded their comments with some word of sincere sympathy for his family. Because of the people's estimation of the mill owner's character, the publication of his will created a sensation the like of which was never before known in the community. One half of his estate, including the mill, Adam Ward gave to his family. The other half he gave to his old workman friend, Peter Martin. Millsburg was stunned, stupefied with amazement and wonder. But no one outside the two families, save the interpreter, ever knew the real reason for the bequest. The old basket-maker alone understood that this was Adam Ward's deal with God. It was the contract by which he was to escape the hell of his religious fears, the horrors of which he had so often suffered in his dreams, and the dread of which had so preyed upon his diseased mind. When the necessary time for the legal processes in the settlement of Adam Ward's estate had passed, John called the mill workers together. In his notice of the meeting, the manager stated simply that it was to consider the mutual interest of the employers and employees by safeguarding the future of the industry. When the workmen had assembled, they wondered to see on the platform with their general manager, Helen and her mother, Mary and Peter Martin, the city mayor, with representative men from the labor unions and from the business circles of the community, and sitting in his wheelchair, the interpreter. To the employees of the mill and to the representatives of the people, the announcement of the final disposition of Adam Ward's estate was made. The house on the hill with the beautiful grounds surrounding it became in effect the property of the people, with an endowment fixed for its maintenance. It was to be converted into a center of community interest, one feature of which was to be an institute for the study of patriotism. We have foundations for the promotion of the sciences, of art, and of business, said the legal gentleman who made the announcements. Why not an institution for the study and promotion of patriotism? Research in the fields of social and industrial life that are peculiarly American. Lectures, classes, and literature on the true Americanization of those who come to us from foreign countries. The promotion of true American principles and standards of citizenship in our public schools and educational institutions and among our people. The collection and study of authentic data from the many industrial and social experiments that are being carried on. These are some of the proposed activities. This Institute of American Patriotism would be under the leadership of the interpreter and would stand as a memorial to the memory of Captain Charlie Martin. When the mayor, in behalf of the people, had made a fitting response to this presentation, John told the mill men that their employer, Pete Martin, would make an announcement. The old workman was greeted with cheers. Someone in the crowd called good-naturedly, "How does it feel to be an owner, Uncle Pete?" Everybody laughed, and the veteran himself grinned. "I guess I'm too old to change my feelings much, Bill Seawold," he answered. "And that's about what I'm going to tell you. The lawyers say that I own half of our mill here, that I can do what I please with it. But I can't some way make it seem any more mine than it always was. Mary and I are agreed that we'd like to do what we know Charlie would be in for if he was here, and we've talked it over with John and his folks, and they feel just like we do about it. The lawyers can explain the workings of the plan to you better than I can, but this is the main idea. The whole thing has been made over into a company with John and his mother and sister owning one half and me the other. What John wants me to tell you is that he and his folks are turning one half of their interest, and Mary and me are turning one half of our interest back to you workmen, so that from now on all the employees of the mill will be employers, and all the employers will be employees. With John and me and our folk owning one half, you can see that we're figuring on keeping the management in the proper hands. John will be in the office where he belongs, and the rest of us will be where we belong. Considering our recent demonstration, I guess you'll agree that a lot of us need to be protected by the rest of us from all of us. And now all we have to do is to work. And I'd like to see Jake Vodell or any other foreign agitator try to start another industrial war in Millsburg." It was the interpreter who asked the assembled workmen to endorse a petition to the governor asking clemency for Sam Whaley. The ground upon which the petition was based was that the guilty principal in the crime was still at liberty, that others still unknown were involved with him, that Sam Whaley, by his confession, had saved the mill and the community from the full horrors planned by the agitator, and that under the new standard of industrial citizenship, the former follower of the anarchist might in time become a useful member of society. A solemn hush fell over the company when Peter Martin, Mary, John, and Helen were the first to sign the petition. The old house is no longer empty, deserted, and forlorn. Repaired and repainted from the front gate to the backyard fence, with well-kept lawn, flowers, and garden, it impresses the passer-by with an air of modest home happiness. To Helen and her mother, who live there, to John and his wife Mary, and to the old workmen who live in the cottage next door, the spirit of the old days has returned. The neighbors in passing always stop for a word with the gray-haired woman who works among her flowers, just as she used to do before the discovery of the new process, or with her sweet-faced daughter. The workmen going to and from the mill always have a smile or a word of greeting for the mother and the sister of their comrade manager. Nor is there a man or woman in all the city or in the country round about who does not know and love this Helen of the old house, who, in giving herself so without reserve to the people's need, who has, as the interpreter says, found herself in service. But when the deep tones of the mill whistle sound over the city, the valley, and the hillsides, there's a look in Helen's eyes that only those who know her best understand. And often in these days the neighborhood of the old house rings with the merry voices of Bobby and Maggie and their playmates. From the flats, from the tenement houses, from the homes of the laborers, they come, these children, to this beautiful woman who loves them all and who calls them, somewhat fancifully, her jewels of happiness. "You see," explained little Maggie, "the Princess lady, she just couldn't help finding them their happiness jewels, 'cause her heart was so kind, just like the interpreter said. End of chapter 30. End of Helen of the Old House.